Please welcome to the stage NSC's Chief of External Affairs, Rachel Unruh.
Good afternoon. It is absolutely wonderful to be able to welcome you back here after many years to the 2023 Skills Summit. Looking out at almost 500 faces who've come here from 40 different states across the country to advocate for inclusive skills policy, it's an absolute joy. And I think the best part is none of you have a fake Zoom background, which is incredible. You're all here and we're so excited. We have missed you. It's been 3 long years since we've done this in person. Many of you know this, but I think it always bears repeating that National Skills Coalition is committed to fighting for a national commitment to inclusive skills policy so that workers have the opportunity to achieve a good job and a good life, and so that employers have access to the skilled workforce that they need to survive and thrive. And over the last 20 plus years, working with our network, we've had an impact on developing and implementing hundreds of state and federal skills policies that help make that a reality. Now, that sounds like a lot, right? Hundreds of state and federal skills policies. And if any of you have been to our staff webpage on our website and you see 30 faces smiling back at you, you might wonder, how do 30 people have that kind of impact? Well, the answer is actually in this ballroom. Because if you look around at the different tables here, you're looking at our theory of change and our how. In this room, if you take a look around, you're gonna see business leaders, you're gonna see labor leaders, you're gonna see community college administrators and instructors, leaders of community-based organizations, and a lot more. You're surrounded by people from the workforce system, the higher education system, the career and technical education system, the adult education system, public aid system, criminal justice system. We love systems, and they're all here. And you're gonna be surrounded by advocates for racial and gender justice, for immigrant justice, for environmental justice, advocates for people who are unhoused, people with disabilities, youth, and senior advocates. You're also gonna be surrounded by Republicans, Democrats, and independents. This is our theory of change, that it takes every stakeholder, every system, every movement, and every political stripe to advance equity, to break down the systemic barriers that prevent too many Americans from accessing high-quality, inclusive skills training leading to good jobs. So thank you for being a part of this movement for change. In addition to being part of this movement, I want to thank you for coming to this event in particular. There's a lot of conferences that we all go to, and these are all incredibly rich conferences where we learn a lot about best practices and innovations that are happening in the workforce field being driven by a lot of you. The difference in this conference is that we came together to talk about opportunities right now in Washington, D.C. to scale and sustain those best practices through public policy. And that's because we know that the difference between a best practice or an innovation that can help 20 people develop digital resilience in the face of changing workplace technologies and driving that change in a sustained way for 200,000 people, that is public policy. We also know that the difference between a sector partnership that is helping to build a racially and gender inclusive infrastructure workforce in one community, the difference between that and 1,000 sector partnerships doing that across the country, that's public policy. And we also know that dismantling structural inequality and growing a truly inclusive workforce requires a lot of levers, and one of those is public policy. We also know that public policy is not your day job for most of you. And it's one thing on a list of a lot of things that you have to get done every day. You're running programs that put people on a path to family-sustaining jobs, and you're building that diverse, inclusive force that business leaders need in our local communities to thrive. So we're grateful that you took the time to come to Washington to fight for these policies and to share the experience that you bring to the table from your communities. So we have an incredible lineup of speakers today from our network. And after 2 days of incredible content, we're gonna have a really impactful day on the Hill on Wednesday. And so I'm excited to get all that going, but before we do that, there's a few thank yous that I wanna extend to people in this room. So first of all, please help me thank our Skills Summit champion sponsors, Comcast, JP Morgan Chase, McDonald's, and Walmart. Their support and their partnership and their commitment really made this event possible this year. And then I also want to thank the Hilton Foundation for underwriting 45 scholarships to ensure that community-based organizations that are running amazing programs on the ground were able to come to this Skills Summit this year. I also want to give a very special thank you to our state delegation leads. If you're a state delegation lead, can you stand up? Don't be shy. So thanks to these state delegation leads in partnership with our government affairs team, we anticipate that we're going to have over 150 meetings on the Hill on Wednesday with offices and agencies. These leaders from our network, they've helped recruit, organize, and prepare the attendees from their states for these meetings. They're incredible leaders of our network. These are the faces of our network, and we really thank you for all that you've done to help make this a success. Let's also give a hand to the amazing National Skills Coalition team, because every single member of our staff has had a hand in this event. If you see somebody with a name tag that says National Skills Coalition, please take a minute to say thank you. I also want to thank our incredibly talented event management partners at Balcom Group. I have been lobbying them to change their tagline to, "We guarantee none of your pre-event anxiety dreams come true," and they have made good on that. Nobody here is barefoot. I'm not riding a bus around DC looking for coffee, so let's give them a hand. And finally, I want to ask you to join me in thanking the people here at the Omni Showroom who make sure that you have a place to lay your head and food to eat, and those are the members of Unite Here Local 25. So just to close out, I've been coming to this Skills Summit first as an advocate from Illinois and then as a staff member for over 20 years now. And I always tell new staff who are experiencing the Skills Summit for the first time that this is the event where I kind of recharge my battery because connecting with people from across the country who are doing this work, who are allies in this work, on the ground, who are innovating, who are taking risks, it's really inspiring, and it's what keeps me fighting for change throughout the year in a city where change can be kind of crushingly hard won. And so it's a great opportunity to do that. And it's been 3 long years since we've been here together. It's been tough years for a lot of people. And so I hope that after spending 2 days here, after spending a day on the Hill, bringing your experience to elected officials, that you leave here inspired as well and ready to make change. So thank you for coming. I'd like to now welcome up to the stage our CEO, Andy Van Kleunen, who's going to kick off our first plenary.
Well done. Good afternoon. It is so great to see all of you here. Again, I'm Andy Van Kleunen. I'm CEO of National Skills Coalition, and let me echo Rachel's comments that to have you here in the room with us today, to be doing this work over the next few days, to change the conversation here in Washington about skilled work and skilled workers is incredibly important. So we can't thank you enough for your being here, and it's just been a long 3 years, and we're glad to have you back. And for those of you who are tuning in online for our first session today on realizing the equity promise of infrastructure jobs, welcome to you as well. We're glad that you're joining us today, and we hope that maybe you'll join us here in DC next year. There's room for more, so please come. But let me talk a little bit about where it is that we are today compared to where we were when we were back here in February of 2020. Boy, that was a tough 3 years. It was tough 3 years for a lot of businesses and working people. The pandemic had an incredible impact on a range of folks all over the country, tens of millions of folks who lost their jobs. Some of them got hired back, oftentimes not in the same job that they were originally working in. And those impacts were particularly hard on folks working in the service sector, workers of color, women, folks without a college or a high school degree. They felt the disproportionate impact of that pandemic in economic terms in a way that some of them have still not recovered from. But it also was a several-year period of unprecedented federal rescue and recovery response, and that's some of what we're going to talk about today. Over $2.5 trillion in the federal expenditures between the American Rescue Plan and then a year later, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act, potentially creating 15 million jobs over the next 10 years. That is amazing. In a 21st century transportation infrastructure, mass transit and rail, EV and charging stations, roads and bridges, a clean energy future, both clean energy generation as well as its distribution, cleaner communities, clean water, environmental remediation in communities that have been disproportionately impacted by environmental injustice, broadband to every corner and every community in this country, and the ability for more Americans to make use of it. An expansion of domestic production for everything from semiconductors to high-capacity batteries. That is something that we have never seen in terms of federal response to a recession like we saw in the past couple of years. But even more important than the scale of that response has been its focus. And for this, we give the Biden administration a great deal of credit, because they recognize that we could not just be making capital investment in these changes to our economy, but we needed to be making investments in people, in workforce development, and doing it in a way that was going to have equitable outcomes for a range of different folks disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. From the first day of the Biden administration, when the president signed the executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities, and in all the conversations that we've had with them since then about how that was going to impact how we're going to implement the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act. That has been incredibly important, and we're here today to talk about how are we doing. Just a note, for us to achieve this, it's everyone in this room and everybody watching who is involved in workforce development and employment efforts. You are a key part to making sure that we realize both the scale of what we're trying to do with these federal investments and the equitable outcomes that we hope to achieve. And so we want to make sure that you all are in conversation with policymakers here in DC about these issues over the next couple days. What I want to do first is to share some of the conversations that I've had the privilege to have with a number of members of the Biden cabinet and the White House executive staff on these very issues over the past 2 years. So we're going to play some video for you, and then I'm going to be joined by some national colleagues to talk about where we are today on some of this work. Good afternoon. I'm Andy Van Kleunen, CEO of National Skills Coalition. Welcome to our latest fireside chat.
It's such a huge opportunity. I mean, first of all, let me just say thank you for your really tireless advocacy over the years for a more inclusive and equitable economy. I just think these three laws give us our best shot at building up that inclusive, equitable economy from the bottom up and the middle out, as the president likes to say. And that's because the investments in these laws are going to get us to make things in America again. And you know, when we gave up this just drove me crazy as the former governor of Michigan, when we gave up our manufacturing backbone years ago, or at least good chunks of it, to chase the promise of cheap labor. The result ended up being a hollowed out middle class. And with the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Law and the CHIPS Act, we're putting the full force of the federal government into rebuilding that backbone. And we're doing it by building up America's competitiveness in the industries that are going to drive the future and command the economy, even globally. Clean energy technologies and the guts, the components that power those technologies, like critical materials and semiconductors. That, as Wayne Gretzky would say, that's how you skate to where the puck is going rather than to where the puck is.
That's a really important question, Andy. And as you said, it was on day one that President Biden signed an executive order that directed the whole of the federal government to do all that it can to advance equity and racial justice. And I'm proud that I've been given the responsibility of quarterbacking that effort. As we try to continue to make progress tackling the pandemic and getting our economy back on track, as you know well, we truly cannot afford to return to the way things were before. The president believes deeply that we have to seize this moment to reimagine and rebuild a new economy that serves everybody, leaves nobody out and no one behind. The bipartisan infrastructure law, which we've already touched on, is a great example of how we're doing that. If we implement the bipartisan infrastructure law to its full potential, we can make great progress towards narrowing the racial and gender wealth gaps, creating good jobs, addressing historic forms of discrimination and structural barriers that have held back women and people of color and people with disabilities, whether in the workplace or by advancing climate justice or by building rural and tribal prosperity, which all taken together would mean a more resilient and equitable future for millions and millions of Americans.
The Good Jobs Challenge, it's a $500 million. It's competition. We want cities, states to build coalitions to come forward to compete for the money. And it's designed to do what we did in Rhode Island, which is bring all the actors to the table to support local talent pipelines. So that means, and it's very bottom-up driven, community organizers, nonprofit training partners, community colleges, unions, partnering with employers. And the employers need to make commitments to hire, and they need to be part of designing the curriculum for the job training. We're also very much encouraging of earn while you learn type models. In Rhode Island, we learned, you asked about my experience, we learned this was one of the most impactful things we could do to get particularly mid-career folks back to work. And particularly if you want women, people of color, low-wage folks, single parents. If you're a, 45-year-old woman with 2 kids working a minimum wage job, you cannot give up your job to go back to college. Can't do it. So you need an apprenticeship or earn while you learn type of a thing where the employer pays you to work and trains you.
You get a little humility when you come to Washington if you didn't have it before you got here. And you have to understand that not one size does not fit all. Right. For example, what might be, happening in North Dakota is not necessarily happening on the streets of New Orleans. So you really have to rely on the governor and the mayors to use their convening power to bring together their business leaders, their faith-based leaders who may be different than someplace else. And they might be building a different thing there. So it's really important for us to engage them, not tell them what to do, but use the convening power of the White House like we did, and you came to it. And you saw some of the business leaders there who said, oh, wow, I don't have to wait for I can go do this now. And so we're hoping, again, that they're starting this very, very early, because we're certainly not dictating it. We're just lifting up to people that we got a huge challenge and that the solution is in the communities in America, and it is a fantastic opportunity to put people to work. Look, at a time when the unemployment rates are low, it's going to be an issue. And so let's not wait, to figure out, a year from now. Let's get ready and let's make sure we connect people, and we're very intentional about it. And I'll just finally say this. You know, the good book says, seek and you shall find. If you go look for folks who are there, you'll find them. If you don't go look for them, don't know how to look for you, you can't ever find them. So that's why we say you have to be intentional about this. And on top of that, it is this president's view that diversity is this nation's greatest strength. The workforce is changing. People of color have to be let in. Women have to be let in. They have to have the tools necessary to get in. They have to have the training. And when they do that, and they build generational wealth, they're going to really push this country, you know, as far ahead and as fast as the country, you know, hasn't seen in quite a long time.
Well, I was on a call before this with a group of local elected officials, and there was 300 or 400 people on the call, and you know, I was talking to them. But if I had a chance to talk to them one-on-one, they would all tell me the need for workforce development, job training, apprenticeship program, because most communities in our country are dealing with the issues of inequity. They're dealing with people that are underemployed. We're coming out of a pandemic. So I do think that the urgency is now. And I think more people realize it than we realize. So I don't think we have to explain to anyone why to do it. I think it's just a matter of making sure we make these investments, because you make these investments in people, in job training, you know who's going to benefit? Not only them and their family, but the companies, the economy, our country.
Great, and we're back. And I'm here. I'm not here in my yellow home office. I'm actually sitting here on a stage with real people with a chance to talk to them and to all of you about these issues. First, can I get a round of applause for all of the NSC team, the External Affairs and Communication and Government Affairs folks, who make those fireside chats possible. We feel it's a really good opportunity to kind of get a chance to have some one-on-one conversations with folks who are making some important decisions here in DC. But now, and you've probably heard some of the themes that we've kind of talked about. Clearly, equity and inclusion, investments in workforce training, moving people towards good jobs, building partnerships with industry, the key role of state and local officials, the very things that those Biden administration officials were thinking about a year or so ago. That's what we're going to talk about today. How are we doing? What more does Congress and the administration and state and local policymakers need to do to make sure that we are going to achieve success and equity, and how it is that we implement these federal investments? And what more can we be doing with private sector stakeholders, business, labor, community colleges, community organizations, workforce boards, others who are all in this room today, to make sure that we're doing our part in partnership with those government officials and programs? And so, to start to take stock of that, I'm joined by an incredible group of national leaders on these issues. So let me introduce who's sitting here with me today. First, right to my left, Congressman Andy Levin. Congressman, former member of the House of Representatives and a leader on the House Education and Labor Committee for his entire time in Congress. He also was a prior State Secretary of Labor in the state of Michigan under Governor Granholm, now our Secretary of Energy. And currently is working as a distinguished senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, advising them on some of the things around infrastructure implementation, and particularly on some of the clean energy parts of it, because he's worked in that area in between his other times in public service. So, Andy, good to have you here.
Thanks, Andy.
Next, Stephanie Martinez-Ruckman. So Stephanie is the Legislative Director for Human Development at the National League of Cities. Stephanie's been a longtime partner of ours and working on these issues here in Washington, advocating for these investments in workforce development. She's going to have a lot to share about that. Stephanie, good to have you here today. Next is Broderick Johnson. So Broderick is the Executive Vice President for Public Policy and Digital Equity at Comcast, and has been working a lot on these issues at Comcast. He also has had several turns here in Washington doing a number of different things, including he was the former Secretary of the Cabinet for the Obama administration. Broderick, really great to have you here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And finally, Melissa Wells. Melissa is Special Assistant to President Sean McGarvey at the North America's Building Trades Unions, or NABTU, as we like to call it here in DC. And in addition to being a leader in the labor movement, Melissa also is an elected state legislator in the Maryland House of Delegates. Melissa, great to have you here today.
Good to be here.
All right, so let's start having some conversations about where we think we are. Andy, I'm going to start with you. Let's start about where it is that we happened in Congress prior to the investments that we were talking about here. When you were in Michigan, you were working for the state of Michigan at a time of economic recovery, and it was very clear that the state knew that you needed to have both investments in capital and investments in people as a way to kind of drive that recovery, and I think that the Biden administration recognized that as well, and had originally put together an infrastructure plan that had in the same plan both investments in capital infrastructure and investments in people. $100 billion was in the original American Jobs Plan, another $109 billion for free community college that could have also helped people kind of prepare for some of those jobs. But as we know, that did not make it across the finish line. We passed the capital investments in Congress, and then we put all of the people investments in a thing called Build Back Better, which you worked very hard to try to get out of the House, but we did not get it all the way through. So maybe let's talk a little about that. How does it that we still wound up making the mistake of taking the human investment away from the capital investment, and how did that conversation play out up on the Hill?
Well, we came pretty darn close, and we just, the margins in the 117th Congress, in the House and the Senate, weren't big enough. Nancy Pelosi ran an extremely disciplined ship in the House, and we don't have the evil problem of the filibuster, which they have in the Senate, which, if I have to say it, is not in the Constitution. It's not in the original way the Senate was set up. It should be eliminated as soon as possible, and the majority should rule in the Senate. But I remember we got all, with my bill, the America's College Promise Act. You can imagine what it feels like when the president, Biden's running for president, he adopts your bill as his vehicle, like, oh my God, and we came really close with that. Senator Sinema ended up supporting it. It really came down to one person, Joe Manchin, who wouldn't support it, and that's why that didn't happen. Because of the filibuster, what we were doing had to go through the reconciliation process if we were going to get it done. A lot of us were opposed to breaking it up into two pieces like that. We wanted to run the whole thing through the reconciliation process. And I think we ended up, being proven right in the sense that we needed that leverage to get the people part in. Why on earth anyone thinks we can build huge battery factories and that we can build factories to make computer chips, and we could do this in an inclusive way and not have significant job training and not have childcare included? It's just, forget about ideology or party politics. It's not practically possible to do that. It just isn't. So, we tried hard, but look, I'm sure we'll come back to this, but let me just close by saying this. We passed these 3 Investing in America bills, if you want, and I had experience, and you were sort of at my side in an informal way, when I ran the workforce system of the state with the highest unemployment rate for 49 consecutive months. And even though ARA was so much smaller than it needed to be, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, under $800 billion, right? Whereas we did much more for that, even aside from these bills, we did much more just in the recovery from the pandemic, and then we created all this. So look, in those days, just trying to be scrappy and creative, I think we got $135 million of extra money for workforce, some from foundations, but mostly by competing, like Secretary Raimondo was talking about, competing for federal money that was part of this. So right now, we have a chance to try to push the federal agencies, and then when the money goes to the states, to push them. How much of this will be for workforce? How much will be for training? How will you creatively include the need to help America's workers and businesses be able to do this work, compete for this work? So we got a lot of work to do here.
And I definitely want to talk about what we can do both with agencies and with state and local policymakers. But just on Congress, so we do have a couple pieces of legislation that if we could pass them, could at least move us incrementally forward. And I know you worked a lot on funding for the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. You worked a lot on trying to make Pell Grants more available to working folks who would go into quality short-term programs that led to jobs. So we still do have a legislative agenda that we should be trying to figure out, even as we're now trying to go to agencies and state and locals to come up with some of those resources as well, right?
And there's a lot of it's bipartisan. And so even if, like the Jobs Act, the thing about Pell Grants, making Pell Grants available for short-term training, for people who aren't full-time. Which one of your interlocutors there was talking about? You know, you're not going to have people who have kids or people who, you know, started college and didn't finish, who've been working and they need some training. They can't go full-time back to school. So why don't we modernize Pell Grants to make them practical so people can use them? Companies like Comcast and other employers are begging for people with this and that certification, this and that skill set. Let's make it happen. So it's really important. Don't go up there cynical about D's and R's. You can find a way to convince. I had a lot of great Republican colleagues working with me on the Jobs Act. And the fact that some of their leadership wouldn't do it, okay, we still have to keep trying. We have to build that base in both parties so we can pass this whenever it's possible. So there's a lot of work to do.
Absolutely. One last thing, and I want to go to some other folks, but I know now in your current role at CAP, you've been doing a lot of talking to some of the agencies that are trying to implement some of these laws. And since you come out of, you know, energy issues when you were working in the state of Michigan, I know you've been talking to the Energy Department, you've been talking to EPA and others, not really agencies that typically have a job training or workforce development strategy. I'm kind of curious, like, what you have found the initial conversations that you've been having with them on some of these issues.
First of all, I think we're starting from the highest baseline we ever had about goodwill, intention, efforts to create a more inclusive workforce, more inclusive opportunities. But not, look, the EPA getting this much money, what experience or capacity does the EPA have to figure out job training and, you know, job opportunities for these funds? And same with the Department of Energy. And the way that some of the training money went, not mostly to the Department of Labor, that was a big mistake in my point of view, because the Labor Department drives this hardest. So I think there's a lot of goodwill here, but we have a lot of opportunity to get into the weeds with them and go program by program, line item by line item, and talk about what guarantees for workers' rights are there here, what guarantees for job training, what funds could be used, so that they can set aside some of the money for training the people we need to do the work. So I think the conversations are terrific, but the complexity and the breadth of what we passed in these three bills, you know, trillions of dollars of new investment and how it's all going to be rolled out, they're very busy, they're very harried. We need to be the people, all the people in this room, all the people watching, need to be the people who go to the EPA, to Energy and Commerce, all the departments that have a hand in this, and say, oh, we'll help you. Yeah, your people are complaining about the workforce. You have a chance with these dollars to set some of them aside to train people, apprenticeship programs, pre-apprenticeships, work with your community colleges. So the conversations are good, but the real difference is made in the details, and there's a lot of work to do.
For sure, and there's a lot of folks here in this room who know what some of those details are, so thanks for the encouragement on that. Stephanie, let me come to you, because you are an organization that has been working a lot, the League of Cities with the Department of Labor. But first, just for everybody here in the room, could you tell a little bit about what the National League of Cities are, and what are the cities that you're typically working with?
Sure, so we represent the 19,000 cities, towns, and villages across the country. So our largest member is New York City, and our smallest is the city of Thurmond, West Virginia, in which there are 5 residents. So urban, rural, large, and small. And, you know, if we poll our members for their sort of political affiliation, it's a pretty even bell curve, pretty naturally, in terms of where individual mayors, city council members find themselves along the political spectrum. So, you know, we really are bringing sort of that city voice to the table, sort of how is that money getting down to the ground level, and how are they serving the residents in their communities?
So, as I mentioned in your introduction, League of Cities has been an incredible partner with us in trying to advocate for these investments in workforce training as part of the implementation of these federal programs, capital investments. Why? Why does that matter to the mayors and the city leaders that you're working with?
Well, I feel like NLC was at the comprehensive infrastructure investment game far longer than I was there. And, you know, as the congressman said, you know, you want roads, you want bridges, you want water systems, you want broadband networks. But robots aren't building all these things today, at least, or maintaining them. So how are you investing in those people who are going to build and maintain that infrastructure in communities? And so for cities, it's not just the private businesses that are in those communities, but it's also the municipal workforce. You know, you have individuals who work for city public works departments who are doing that work on the ground as well, too. So it was really important for us that that investment in the workforce was at scale with that investment in the physical infrastructure as well, so that those things could move at the same pace in the communities.
Are mayors concerned now that we didn't actually get the level of investment in workforce training that we might have thought 2 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, workforce went to the top of our list. And we stayed at the White House too. I was like, wow, we've never talked so much about workforce in Congress in a real way in a long time by itself. Because that investment, that was so close, didn't come through the infrastructure bill. So, we've been working really closely, as you alluded to, sort of with the administration to figure out, okay, so how can cities use the monies that they do have? Cities got $65 billion through the American Rescue Plan Act, which is great. Cities like where I live in Baltimore, they spent $30 billion on workforce itself. But if you're the city of Thurman, West Virginia, that money went to sort of paying your bills and keeping the lights on. So there's less flexibility in some of those smaller and even medium-sized communities too. So thinking about where you can leverage funds and where there are additional federal resources or state resources even to sort of meet that need is really important.
Now, I know the League has been doing a lot of work with the Department of Labor. Folks may have seen that the department just recently announced a new $80 million grant initiative on building pathways to infrastructure jobs. This is some of the discretionary money that they do have, even though they didn't get special appropriated money for some of this, and so they're putting some of that to that. But they are also trying to figure out how it is that they can work with some of the cities in your network. Did you want to tell a little bit about that new initiative?
Sure. So hot off the presses, actually, applications closed on Friday. The Good Jobs, Great Cities initiative. We're really working with Department of Labor. We'll be selecting 12 communities from across the country to really spend a year of technical assistance with communities to either build a new or scale a current workforce partnership, sector folks partnership on infrastructure jobs. So whether that's roads and bridges, construction jobs, clean energy jobs, semiconductor workforce, whatever that city identifies as that need in their community. So we're excited. I mean, we sort of had unprecedented interest in some of the informational webinars that we did with communities on this. So we're sort of hoping we blow that need out of the water, both to show DOL and frankly the administration at large about where that need is for communities to build that type of work.
What are some of the issues that folks have identified that they could really use some help with?
Well, some of it is just sort of like building that pathway within these sectors. Really, we like to talk about cities as conveners. How are they bringing together the community colleges? How are they bringing together the employers? How are they bringing together all of those players in their community to look at the data and to look at the opportunity? Sort of not just what employers are looking to fill today, but what is that projection for 10 years, 15 years from now, so they can really start thinking about how they're working with the K-12 system and really helping high school kids understand, I can work in the drinking water or wastewater utility sector. What does that look like? I can get paid more than being an attorney? Great, let's do that.
Right.
But I don't know, when I went to high school, no one was talking to me about that. I grew up
talking to you about wastewater
I grew up in
high school?
DC. Everyone's parent was a lawyer or worked for the administration. But when you go and look at some of the work that cities are doing to sort of partner with the school system to say, here is where your water comes from. Here is why it's important, and that maybe that is a career that you're interested in. That's important. Now, that's not going to build the roads tomorrow necessarily, but then, 20 years from now, we aren't still talking about filling that gap.
Yeah, we've consistently heard this, that we know that the number of jobs to be created is big. We also know in a lot of these sectors, the number of people going to be retiring from these jobs over the next several years is going to be big. So there's two big numbers that we're trying to get our arms around, and what particular industries and occupations, where are those going to hit, and in your particular city or county, how is that going to look? We get a lot of questions about that, and I think that's going to be a key part of how it is that we're going to have to help folks target those resources properly based on what we think is both current demand as well as that future demand.
Yeah, NLC did a great, I think it's great, report on sort of hard to fill infrastructure jobs and sort of breaking down that by congressional districts, so we can say to members of Congress, yes, it's a problem, but here is what it looks like in your district, so you have real numbers to talk about what that looks like. And that's just sort of real jobs today. That says nothing about sort of the huge influx of what those jobs will look like in the future with the investments.
I would highly recommend it. It's a very slick website, this thing that they set up at League of Cities. Go take a look at it. All right, well, so let's move to another agency and another part of the infrastructure investment, which is on broadband, expanding broadband to every community, every person in this country. Broderick, I want to turn to you because I know Comcast obviously is very focused on what's going on with this. You're a huge broadband provider. You as Comcast are in the country, and we're now going to invest $42.5 billion in expanding broadband through the BEAD program that's being administered by the Department of Commerce. But we know, as National Skills Coalition, we've always wanted to make sure that the digital equity conversation is looking at what we're doing in terms of physical broadband and even in putting more devices in people's hands. Right. But we also recognize that there's many, many people in this country who don't actually have the digital skills to make use of that broadband if we were so expand it. I know this is a personal area of interest for you, so I just want to start for why are you and Comcast paying so much attention to this digital equity issue as part of how it is that we're thinking about the bigger broadband project?
Sure. Well, thanks, Andy. Can I first say, though, to Stephanie, lawyers supposedly have fun, too.
I know.
I know some
We
that
need
do.
them.
We need lawyers badly,
too.
right? Especially who have fun in life. You know, it's nice to see everyone. It's good to be outside of those like Hollywood square boxes and actually have conversations and to see real people. And so it's great to be here. And I'm joined by a number of colleagues from the company as well. What's also interesting is, like, for me, and we'll talk about my personal commitment, of course, but this panel sort of represents for me my life in terms of where I was raised, where I went to school, and the company I work for. I'll come to that. But so I joined Comcast almost 2 years ago. Time flies when you're having fun, and actually I say that very seriously in that I work for a great company with great colleagues, deeply committed to achieving digital equity. I joined the company as an executive with two roles. One, to be the head of public policy. The second, a newly created, very unique role to oversee all of the company's digital equity work. And that's because digital equity's been in the DNA of Comcast really for over 12 years, and I'll give you a sense of how. We have had something called Internet Essentials for over 12 years now, and more than 10 million people have been able to sign up for very low-cost internet access for that period of time, over 10 million. And it's a commitment that we continue as we look forward. We've made $1 billion investment going forward in something called Project Up, because we realize and have realized for a long time how important it is for people to have access, especially lower income folks in our communities. We also appreciate the power of partnerships. So this isn't just about Comcast doing it as a company, but it's about the grants that we actually make to community-based organizations and also working with federal, state, and local government. I should say too, I've been in Washington for 4 decades now. I worked on the Hill. I was at the Education and Labor Committee. It used to go back and forth from workforce to labor to whatever.
Still does.
Yeah, I know. I was there when the Republicans took over, and they named it the Committee on Economic and Educational Opportunities. And it took them about 6 months to realize the acronym was EOC. Seriously, so they decided to change it to workforce, right? And I worked with your dad quite a bit during that period of time, and working for 2
Maybe
presidents
Comcast
as well.
could help the Republicans keep the word labor in there. That would be good.
We tried. I don't think I'll just say. Let's talk about, though, what is so important, and you alluded to this in terms of, we've got deployment. So we all recognize that deployment to rural America has been particularly challenging. So there's over $42 billion to address that. So much of rural America, with the public and private money that companies like Comcast will invest, we'll see great progress there. We also know that broadband has been virtually ubiquitous in many cities for some time, especially now. And so it's not so much about the access, although there still are areas in the country cities where access and deployment is still an issue. We recognize that. But again, for many people, they just don't realize that they actually have access to, say, the American Connectivity, the Affordable Connectivity Program, and the fact that there are now these subsidies to help people get broadband. So there's deployment, and then there's access. And then, as I mentioned, affordability has been a big barrier. But look, none of those things, and they're all conditions precedent to achieving digital equity. But individually and collectively, they're not enough. And this goes to relevance and the importance of people understanding that through the use of broadband, they can empower themselves and their lives, and especially given where we are with the need for digital skills training, to prepare for jobs not just of the future, but jobs today that require so much in terms of basic skills, but quickly are requiring even more sophisticated skills. So again, it's in our DNA. We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to address these things, and Comcast is fully committed, all in, and has been for a while.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the fact that obviously work is becoming increasingly digitalized, and that change in the labor market during the pandemic, where the future of work was something that we were talking about was eventually going to happen, and then it just suddenly happened. Everything became digitalized, online, learning, working, interacting with folks. It just totally changed the threshold about what level of digital skill was required to be able to not just go to school, or do other things at home, but even to hold on to a job or get a new job.
Yeah.
I know Comcast has been great in promoting a piece of research that National Skills Coalition recently published with the support of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. It's called Closing the Digital Skill Divide. Amanda Burson-Shilcock and Broderick Taylor, and I think Nye Hodge, the three authors of that report, are in the room today, and you can find an executive summary of it in your conference app. But the findings of it are striking. 92% of the jobs today are going to require some significant level of digital skills, whether about half of that are jobs where it's like written into the job descriptions. It's very clear, the very technical digital skills. And another half of those are ones that there are things that you're going to have to do that you can pretty much figure out. If you don't have digital skills, you will not be able to do that. So 92% of the jobs. And yet we have a full third of folks in this country, based on other research that's happened prior, who actually don't have digital skill sufficiency at that level in order to be able to fill those jobs effectively. That's an incredible problem. That's a scale of unheard of in terms of a challenge that we have in front of us. I'm just curious what you and Comcast thought about that in terms of what it is that we will need to do to rise to that challenge.
Yeah, so we know not only that like 92% of jobs require at least one digital skill, not just foundational, right? It's even becoming more important for more sophisticated digital skills literacy. But for workers, we also have a responsibility and opportunity to help them understand what having digital skills training can mean for their economic situation. Virtually an $8,000 raise for most workers if they have a digital skill and apply that to a job where that's necessary. We know how important it is for employers. Employers can save $25,000, I think that's what the study found, by making sure that they are upskilling the workers who work for them already, so they're not having to replace those workers. And we also know it matters so much for small businesses. So we at Comcast understand that across the board. I'd like to give an example, though, of where I've seen this play out in terms of the service industry. Before I joined Comcast, I actually headed up a coalition that included Walmart and the National Retail Federation, and it looked at service industry jobs and the importance of those jobs as entry-level jobs. Went to a work site, to a Walmart in Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and actually saw it play out in the sense that the cashiers, right, those jobs were sort of going away. People who had those jobs were now getting opportunities by using digital devices to check on inventory, to help people locate where products were in the store, but also to fill online orders. At that point, this was just starting to emerge as a big business for Walmart, but it was just so clear that for people to continue to have jobs, including in the service industry, digital skills was going to be so important. And it was wonderful to watch people adapt to those jobs as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a great point. I mean, our campaign, the Digital Equity at Work campaign, is trying to bring focus to this particular issue, that there are people who are currently in jobs who may not have those jobs several years from now, and we're not investing in them now on the job. And we feel that government can play a role in working with the employer community to do some of that, as well as what we can do to be getting people digital skills to get into new jobs that they've never held before. So the work component of it is just so incredibly essential, and I thank Comcast for bringing some greater light to some of those issues.
Sure.
Melissa, let me come down to you. So, when we say infrastructure, people immediately think roads, bridges, build infrastructure. And so at the end of the day, it's going to be the folks in the building trades are going to have a huge role in helping to build some of that build infrastructure. First, maybe just to tell a little bit about who the members of NABTU are.
Sure.
And how, how NABTU has kind of changed over the years that you've been thinking about some of these workforce issues.
Absolutely. So North America's building trade unions, we're made up of the 14 national and international building trades. So you have your electrical workers, you have your boilermakers, your HVAC, so plumbers and pipe fitters, laborers, LIUNA, cement masons and plasterers. So it runs a full gamut of those various 14 crafts. And basically, at some point in your lives and your day, there's probably a space you're in that was built by or is maintained by, or as you're driving, you would see these things taking place. And so historically, the folks that have come out of the building trades have not looked like me, right? Just gonna call the elephant out in the room, right? And that's also been the case for a lot of our industries, not just in construction. You can look at tech, higher ed. This is a challenge that we face in this country. And so what NABTU has really been focusing on is how do we ensure that where we live and where we work, that the workers in those communities that are building our roads, that will build the battery factories, that will build our microchip semiconductor factories, making sure that they look like the folks there, but with a specific focus on targeting and intentionally increasing the presence of workers of color, women, workers that are just as involved. And so that has been the work of NABTU for about 15 years now. I actually I didn't come through the building trades in terms of coming up through a trade. I came out of a space very similar to, I think, many of you in this room. And a lot of the work I did over my career has been around closing the racial wealth gap. And one of the things that I noticed in my travels, doing a lot of work around financial security, doing a lot of work around predatory lending, especially payday lending, the bottom line was that at the end of the day, your starting line in terms of what you can save, you cannot financial literacy your way out of poverty, right? Like, yes, being able to, being able to save and understanding how to make good decisions is great, but you have to have a good starting point. And for me, I noticed that your wages, your benefits in terms of your health care, I learned on my own before Obamacare, I had to go get my own insurance, and I thought it was easy, and it wasn't, and it was expensive. That not all healthcare is created equally in terms of the private market. And so I started to understand that historically, in the past, that you had, especially when it came to the unionized sector, that really helped build the middle class, right? It helped in terms of having the collective bargaining rights, in terms of safety, in terms of being able to have your retirement security. And so that's kind of how I got into the building trades. And then wanting to really being focused on, I want to make sure that as our country becomes more diverse, as people of color, historically marginalized, excluded individuals become the majority, that they also have the chance to benefit from these amazing economic models and these workforce models as well. So that's kind of the lens that I bring into this space. And so I cut my teeth working in Baltimore, DC, and really thinking about what are the structural ways that we can get people. One of the things that I love about NABTU is it's not enough to say we want to get more people into the space. We want to, check off all the various key demographics and, communities that have not been included. We really have to focus on the stepping stones. And I'm a believer in setting a goal is one thing, but what is the plan? And also, where are you putting your dollars when it comes to that plan? And so for NABTU, we invest $2 billion annually. That's our dollars, as well as in coordination with our private sector partners. Those partners vary in terms of people as big as Bechtel, who are doing the big Intel project in Columbus, Ohio, to Southern Power down in Alabama, and to a whole host of other individuals, as well as local government, Los Angeles County, City of San Francisco. So just to kind of give you a little bit of the breadth of the various partners at the table. And I think that the other piece that's really, really important is that not only are we putting the money there, but we also took stock. And so during COVID, we did a survey. It was done by iSeries, which is the Institute for Construction. I can't figure out the last three of the acronym, but it is a private industry. It is a private, independently funded research project that includes researchers from University of Michigan, Michigan State, as well as Rutgers. And we looked at diversity in the construction industry. So it's the first of its kind research in looking at not just the unionized sector, but the non-union as well, and looking at where we are when it comes to diversity. And the bottom line is that we still have room for growth in the industry. In our sector, in the unionized sector, we've seen a jump from 2 to 4% in women, right? That's great, we were able to double it, but we know that 4% number needs to get higher, right? And so we looked at what was successful, and I'm gonna toot our horn, but the bottom line is that the unionized sector, we have been putting the money behind programs. And it's been those programs like our apprenticeship readiness model, which is multi-craft core curriculum, which provides a stepping stone, it provides exposure, and it's specifically focused on not only introducing people to the industry, but specifically on getting more workers of color into the industry and women. And our data has shown that over the past 6 years, we've seen 20% of those graduates of the program going into registered apprenticeship are women, and 80% are workers of color. And that's just the baseline, right? So if you look at other places across the country, that number is as high as 95%. And so we know that that is a successful model, and we are really working with the administration, working with all of our various partners, some included on the stage here today, to ensure that we look at what's working. We have this tidal wave of work, tidal wave of construction that's going to be happening over the next 15, 20 years that none of us, I think in this room, were here to see under the New Deal. And so we have a lot of our work cut out for us. And we're just really excited to be able to talk about these models and to also work with our partners like yourselves to make this a reality and to think about how do we not shortchange our workers, how do we make sure that we're putting them not only on a pathway to fill the probably millions of jobs, because our one assessment we did looked at only 3 sectors, and it was 250,000 jobs, and that was just small modular, semiconductor, and hydrogen. So we know that the numbers are going to be vast in terms of the work, and we want to make sure that the workers that are there at the table, that they look different than the workers that built the Hoover Dam.
That's great. Let me ask you a little bit more about this concept of partnerships, right? So I think it's a very important point to make that what the building trades are spending out of money that they've negotiated as part of their collective bargaining agreements, that's private money. That's money that's going in there. But I'm sure that there are other partners that some of your locals are working with who are not part of those collective bargaining agreements, including organizations like those in this room, who really depend on things like well-funded, well-targeted government programs to kind of help them do some of their work. I mean, maybe can you tease out a little bit what some of those partnerships look like?
Absolutely. I think one of the things, just to make sure I give our accolades to the federal administration, this is a equity-minded administration, and not just in word, but specifically in how they're even looking at the competitive grant process. So Department of Labor, their good jobs standards is really leading a lot of this work, and this kind of was brought up earlier in the panel around commerce, energy, and DOT. And I know for a fact in our conversations with those agencies and DOL, they are working closely with Department of Labor around those standards. I think the other pieces in terms of the funding element, a lot of this money, we know that we have $200 billion left of ARPA that has not been obligated as of yet. And so thinking about how do we continue to work with our councils, to work with their local workforce partners, as well as their local government, city and county, to marshal those funds and utilize them for training. I think that's one of the biggest things in my walkabout, just in my first year with NABTU, is that there's a lot on the plate of local government. So I want to make sure I'm articulating this in a generous way. But there's also, we find ourselves kind of serving as a bit of an intermediary with our councils and with local government to say, hey, there's opportunity to utilize your formula funds for training that's coming from the bipartisan infrastructure. There's also more dollars still left from ARPA as well. And I think that that's where perhaps the private sector or industry partners that don't have a stake there just yet and aren't able to provide those funds, that's where I think there's chance for the funding to be utilized and leveraged to get people into apprenticeships, to get them prepared, and to get them ready for the tidal wave of work. And the last thing I want to say is that I think oftentimes people think, oh, we have to wait for this big project to start. And I always say, local government, you have your capital budget, right? Those capital budgets, those exist outside of the bipartisan infrastructure. The maintenance of your sewer system, your roads, sidewalks. I mean, there's a whole host of already existing projects. School construction is something that's really big. There's a whole host of projects. And so really also getting folks to think about what are the standards that are being utilized by the federal government, specifically the good job standards that DOL has, which looks at project labor agreements. It looks at pushing and making sure that there's apprenticeship readiness programs in place, coordination with contractors that are part of the registered apprenticeship process, and that are part of making sure that their workers on their projects are in a pathway to a career. So making sure that all those things are starting to happen now, that way once all this money really, it's hitting the streets, but it's gonna come to our front doors in the next 2 years in terms of breaking ground on projects. And so making sure that you are utilizing what you currently have access to prepare for the money that will come to your front door soon.
And that really echoes a message that, Melissa, you and I were part of these events that the White House was doing, the White House Talent Pipeline Challenge, which was last summer, where they were trying to get businesses, labor unions, other folks, many folks in this room who were making commitments like, yes, we will train a certain number of folks for these jobs that are going to be coming down the pipe. And we did talk about the fact that there was unspent money out there. In some cases, some of that American Rescue Plan money, there's a lot of debate about how much is really unspent versus unallocated. So you hear estimates from 25 to 90. JO said 90. Some of the Center on Budget said 25 billion. But we know there's resources out there, right? There's resources that can still be used where we're kind of past the recovery from the pandemic. We really need to be investing in people's futures now, and here's an opportunity to do it. And I think it was really notable, at least for me, who's been doing this for a while, to see that the building trades were out there saying, yes, we think while we negotiate our dollars for our members, we think there's a role that public policy can play to invest in making it easier for more people to get into the pre-apprenticeship programs that they can articulate to our registered apprenticeships. I think that's really significant, and I think that we should all be figuring out how to be working both nationally and locally with unions who are ready to kind of pick that up, that there's a public policy role to be played here, even though we've got, in unionized centers, like most of the work is going to be done by unionized workers who are being trained with dollars that have been negotiated through collective bargaining. So I think that's really important.
Yep.
Well, so we've talked a lot about state and local implementation, so I want to kind of take us out of Washington now and kind of move to some of that part, because clearly state and local policymakers are going to be important. Partnerships of folks in this room working with state and local policymakers is going to be very important. And also, since we're here in DC, to understand what Washington could be doing to make it easier for state and local policymakers to make some of the decisions that they need to make. So Stephanie, I'm going to go back to you on this one. Since we were talking about some of the technical assistance that cities are looking for, like, are there some specific things that you think we could be doing through federal policy or regulation that would make it easier for mayors to kind of bring the resources together to accomplish some of these things?
Flexibility, one word. I mean, I think the beauty of the ARPA funds was that a mayor, a city council, a local community could take that pot of funds and say, these are my challenges. Because no two communities are the same. Everyone experienced COVID. They experienced challenges with their municipal workforce, with service delivery. Recycling was really big, in our town. If you don't pick that up, no one's happy. But you recognize that each community has different challenges to get back on their feet and to make those connections with creating their workforce pipeline and addressing all the other challenges. So flexibility of federal funds that come down to the local level, whether it be ARPA or something else in the future is really important. And we've also really been working with federal agencies to talk about, and with Congress to talk about, what is that technical assistance for communities who aren't here, who may be here, who are just learning to apply for federal grants, because in some communities there's a staff of 4, and you don't have a grant writer. So competing for some of these infrastructure CHIPS, IRA type grants takes a lot. And so not only to apply for it, to win it, and then to implement it on the ground. So I think it's those two things, the flexibility to give communities the opportunity to say what they need and how the funds are best used, and then that support to compete and to have those funds come down.
Yeah, it's interesting, we talk to city leaders too every once in a while, and some of them who have actually applied for those we haven't talked much about the transportation department, but actually transportation's been out in front of a lot of the agencies, at least in terms of getting money on the ground for some of these issues. And they have actually encouraged cities to apply for dollars that include a workforce training component. But it's transportation officials that are applying for those dollars. And then they've got the grant like, oh, wait a second, so how do we actually implement this? So what is it that we could do that can help mayors or others connect them with the education and workforce folks more effectively? Or where do you think are good models where that is actually
What's the
happening?
convener part? Well, I would say it's like not even can use the money on workforce. In some instances, have to and
Right.
tell us how you're doing this. It's the flexibility and then the requirements. And by the way, if you don't say what you're going to do, your grant probably won't be competitive. And so I think that's some of the work we're doing with communities too. It's like, hey, when they tell you you can use a certain percentage of this money to help get workers into these jobs, like not only should you say how you're doing that, but build those partnerships because you need to be competitive for those funds and that it's important. Melissa, you were saying too, I think all of the infrastructure agencies are really putting in the effort to work with DOL to think about, okay, so how do we talk about good jobs and how do we talk about those workforce pipelines to get people into those jobs absent of like an investment in DOL and in sort of the programming that's happening there. Some of that work that we're doing with communities that are figuring it out is talking about, okay, so who are all of the players that you need at the table? Who should we be calling? Your workforce board or your community colleges, to start having those conversations. And to your point too, don't have the conversation like after you got the grant. You'd be having the conversation ideally years in advance, but today would be good to think about, what are the jobs, what are the projects you want to do? What are the workers that you have? I mean, I don't think you'll meet a city leader who will tell you, in fact, most of them will tell you directly, they want to build like local roads with local workers. And so how do you do that? By building those partnerships and having those conversations today about where your gaps are.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
If you don't mind, we have a little dive.
Go for it.
So, particularly with the BEAD money, the ARPA money, as state and local governments are preparing plans, and certainly as a company, again, that's been committed to closing the digital divide, preparing people for not just education, but for jobs and the important skills, we have a lot we can lend to state and local governments as they are preparing these plans. And related then to this discussion, it's so important that the state and local governments focus on what they're going to do to promote digital skills training, particularly partnerships around that. And this is where my colleagues all across the country, across our footprint, are spending a lot of their time in those conversations to help prepare those state and local governments for those plans.
Do you have a good example of a state where you think has kind of embraced that opportunity?
Well, yes. Glad you mentioned it. So that was such a softball.
Didn't see it coming.
There are many examples, but I want to cite an example of in Colorado. So it's a great example. Last month, Serve Colorado signed an agreement with the Colorado Department of Labor. This is something I also want to talk about if we have time, to help promote digital navigation programs, right? We've talked about access, we've talked about deployment, we've talked about relevance, the importance of digital skills training, but if you don't have trusted partners who are actually working in communities to help people understand how to get access and why it matters, then we could see really a loss of this opportunity, which is once in a lifetime. So there's a $3.4 million investment that's being made in Colorado, and for Comcast, we are adding our own investment in that by making a grant of both financial support and in-kind of $600,000 toward that effort. Again, government in partnership with a business in order to promote digital navigation programs in Colorado to help people with digital skills training.
That's excellent, and that comes directly from initiatives like the Digital Equity Act.
Right.
You have folks on the ground, private money, private partners, states making the decision to include those kinds of things and how it is that they're implementing the equity part of the
That's
broadband
right.
expansion.
That's right.
Incredibly important, but it does not happen on its own.
Nope.
It happens with advocacy
Intentional.
in the state to make it happen, and it happens with technical assistance, and it happens with partners on the ground who are working together to show how to
That's
how to
right,
pull it
trusted
together.
partners.
Correct, absolutely right.
It's key.
Andy, let me ask you, so you ran a state workforce agency back in the day, and you did it in a way that particularly you were trying to both leverage what the workforce agency can do and what the state's community college and higher ed system could do to try to get folks back to work? I mean, what would you anticipate are kind of the challenges that state policymakers are facing in this current era of implementation of infrastructure?
Well, first I just have to say how much this conversation takes me back. And I mean, for one thing, Stephanie, I remember the first tranche of aid we put out in the pandemic?
Yeah.
And it only went to beyond states.
Like 12 cities? Yeah.
Well, cities or counties that had 500,000 or more people, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, dang, none of my 21 jurisdictions, the county, you know, I had 2 counties. They were the 2 counties, 2 of the 3, or 2 of the 4 in Michigan that qualified. But none of the local governments did. So a bunch of us got together, you know, and we started advocating. And I think that we really have to hold, you have a big responsibilities, and also the counties, to hold, at some point here when the money's all spent, to show how important that was. Every jurisdiction got some money to spend, and that was a huge thing that we did, and it was a big fight to do it that way. So I want you to educate all of us about why that was so important, that not just Detroit and Macomb County and Wayne and Oakland and Kent County, like in the Michigan context, got the money. But then, Melissa, where were you in my life? Speaking as the state, right? I didn't have any person like this leading the charge. When we did have a senator from Illinois named Barack Obama who got into the safety loop funding, the idea that states could spend up to 0.5% of our heavy highway money to create the workforce of the future for highway construction, which meant women, people of color, and poor people. That's how it was defined. But this was such a good example about how is a transportation department in a state supposed to do this. So Granholm runs for re-election. Some of the church-based community organization folks are demonstrating at her events. Nobody who looks like me is building these highways, right? True enough, really, true, honestly. So she hires me in her second term. She wins re-election. She says, do something, you know, and so that I worked with the Michigan Department of Transportation. Well-meaning, great. They had a whole series of meetings, stakeholders up the wazoo, PowerPoints. I don't know. So I said to my counterpart at MDOT, like, all right, here's the deal. Give me the money, or we're going to do it together. And I went to the church-based folks, and I said, well, if the building trades training directors would meet with you, would you meet with them? I know what you think about them. Would you meet with them to create a program? They said we would. I went to the training directors, who are fantastic. They said we would. And we ended up creating a paid pre-apprenticeship program called RCAR, Road Construction Apprenticeship Readiness. We trained people all over the state to go into these jobs. And, you know, you all know this, I guess, but Melissa's not touting her own thing. I mean, these are great jobs, you know, $50, $60, $70, $80 an hour packages where you don't go into debt, you get paid while you learn, and you come out as a journey person, typically in 4 years or so, and you can write your ticket. You can be a traveler and work all over the United States if you're in a place like Rhode Island, Michigan, Nevada, places that kind of go up and down. You know, you can go elsewhere. So this was a great thing. And what I see right now, Andy, is that we need to have collaborations that go beyond some of just the lingo. So Michigan's a big industry partnership state, and I am really proud of a lot of what our Michigan Works folks, our community college folks, and our state folks did and still do today to bring people together. But you have to sometimes go with where the economy is going. As Secretary Granholm always loves to use the hockey analogy. Skate to where the puck is going, not where it is. So somebody from Ricardo, this company, wanted to meet with the governor. Okay, they said, Levin, you get over here and take the meeting. The governor's not meeting with these people, right? Okay, I go there. They say, oh, we're going to need way more engineers who can do electric vehicles. There were like 500 in the state. We need 5,000. Well, that's a joke today, right? But this was 15 years ago. So we created something called the Michigan Academy for Green Mobility. I think it might still exist. But you know how that was hard work. Broderick, Toyota and GM and Ford and the suppliers had to come and agree. What's your intellectual property? What's mine?
Sure.
This was hard work. They had to agree on what they could have as a common curriculum to take a mechanical engineer or an electrical engineer and bring them into that joint space where they could build. And now we didn't have. There was an early Bolt maybe. I mean, in conception. Now GM, to pick one example, says they're going to be 100% EV by 2035. So I think that what the states need is us to work as hard as we can to get as much of this funding in these three big bills to be flexible or to be flat out dedicated in a competitive way or otherwise for training workers, and then let the state and local officials loose to work with the community college and the workforce folks to create programs like that that meet this moment in places where they're going to be building a battery factory, going to be building chips factory or other kind of thing like that.
That intellectual property sort of skirmish, that was lawyers having fun. You know that, right?
Back to lawyers.
You and me, brother.
But
But we did it.
But a good point, which is, as we're speaking about infrastructure, there's an infrastructure to make that strategy work, right? The state had been making investments in industry partnerships, bringing business and labor and college and community organizations and workforce boards together to make that happen. That is a public policy that a state could implement. It's a public policy that we thought was going to get funded under the infrastructure law. It is still something the Biden administration has just called for a $200 million investment in sector partnerships, industry partnerships, and a new program to be administered by the Department of Labor. But states could be doing that now, just as states could be using their transportation money now to do some of this training. The allowance, the cap was taken off a long time ago. There's no law that's preventing states from doing that.
Hey, 0.5% was plenty. Let me tell you, come on, y'all. What it takes to train workers compared to pour a mile of an expressway, we'll take the 0.5% if they give it to us.
That is right.
To train the workforce.
So it's a combination of we need to do more at the federal level to give some incentives and some resources there. States can be spending money to bring these partnerships by industry together. And then we do think that there should be some flexibility to kind of figure out how it is to make that work in different places. I know, Melissa, in the state of Maryland, Maryland's been investing state dollars in their EARN program, which is one of their industry partnership programs. I'm curious, like, how it is, other things that you think state legislatures could be doing to be helping with this.
So I think you started off perfectly with states can be doing this already, right? I think that's really important because sometimes people, especially as a legislator, I'm always thinking like, okay, what is it I could be doing better? Not only like what the problem is, but what in the problem do I already have the power to have some impact over? So I think the EARN program, I think Maryland is a great place. We're going to have offshore wind coming. We're really excited. Orsted has prioritized equity, has prioritized the local hire piece and just really increasing women and workers of color. There's a project labor agreement on that as well. So that means that there's going to be a clear pipeline of placement for individuals that might leave a building trades apprenticeship readiness program and then placement into one of the various crafts that will be working on that. I think the other piece though, one of the challenges that we do still have in Maryland is we have grown our apprenticeship registered apprenticeships have grown significantly. I cannot think of the number off the top of my head, but I was very enthused by the number I did hear. But we have grown substantially. I think one of the challenges, though, that we struggle with in Maryland is the pipeline of work for placement. So oftentimes, I have our apprenticeship readiness program in Baltimore in an area where it's not transportation rich in terms of people being able to be mobile, and also construction is a project-based, movable type of industry. So there could be a job that might be at Fort Meade, but one of my apprenticeship readiness graduates didn't have a car to get to Fort Meade. Or, unfortunately, a lot of the good contractors that are part of registered apprenticeships are working in DC. DC has their own local hire goals here. Virginia also has their own local hire goals, and the data centers are not accessible. Even if you have a car, that's a hike, but it's doable. But if you don't have a car, you can't get to Loudoun County in order to be on the project. So I think one of the challenges in Maryland is that we're really still trying to understand how to build that pipeline. That's a big, kind of one of my big brands as a state delegate is really thinking about what those pipelines look like and how do we leverage them. And I think the other piece is that there still is a lot of education around how these federal dollars are working. I think in my conversations with some of the various state agencies, they're now finally kind of like understanding like, oh, there are standards, good job standards. Oh, there's the ability to use it. And then I think they're beginning to we're starting to begin to talk about what a plan of action looks like. And I'd venture to guess that Maryland is not unlike a lot of other states in this country that are still figuring it out. A place like California, where they have a robust workforce model, where they really have spent the past 20 years understanding the pipeline piece around jobs, around apprenticeship, readiness, and training, is much further ahead. But I believe that other states that might be further behind, it's doable because we have a lot of great models to look to. And so it's just a matter of looking at those models and adopting them and then right-sizing it for your jurisdiction or for your state.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You mentioned good jobs, and I just want to come back to this because we've been talking about flexibility in terms of implementation, but we want there to be equity achieved. We want folks who are not working in these sectors to be given the chance to work in them and to earn a good career, good wage, and in good jobs. How do we balance those two things between having expectations for what the outcomes are going to be for folks and who's going to be included, and still giving some flexibility for states and locals to figure out what those strategies are going to be? Can we do both of those things at the same time?
Yes.
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 So I think because we're in a room full of folks that I think are at various junctures in terms of training. I think one of the things that I really have been talking to, especially my walkabouts with the federal agencies, is the ecosystem of workforce development, right? Like you have to have a healthy ecosystem. What I mean by healthy ecosystem is you have to have people, like I see Walter Simmons from Prince George's County workforce here. He is working in Prince George's County, one of the key folks that has built relationships with various industry partners. He and I work together when it comes to the construction sector. And then you have to also have the other various folks. So whether it's your Goodwill Industries, the Chesapeake is a partner I've worked closely with. Those various folks have to all, I think, be able to understand what is it that the sector and industry partners need. But industry partners have to also be open and willing to actually have the conversations and work with them. And I think one of the challenges I've seen, at least in Baltimore, is sometimes the industry partners, they don't look at your local workforce provider as being a partner that brings the best of the best. They are bringing the best of the best. And so sometimes industry partners have to also not assume that they only go there to pick the bottom of the barrel. And I don't mean to disparage people, but that is what some industry partners believe they get when they work with a workforce, your local one-stops. And so I think that there is a need to continue to for industry partners to let go of that perception. And there's also a need for us to just continue to have dialogue and working together. And it gets messy and dirty in the sense of sometimes, maybe you might send a person who wasn't the best candidate. Look, that's okay. Let's figure out exactly what that person maybe needed in order for them to be prepared. So not to say they can never come into a apprenticeship program. What was that they needed that would have provided a little bit more stability for them to be successful? And I think that that's something that we really have to keep. There's a lot going on, but I think sometimes a very basic element of these ecosystems, we have to stop and think about it and not just get bogged down on the numbers, but get bogged down on how do we provide access to a life-changing career that is really going to put people on the pathway to economic security and success.
Excellent.
Yeah. So go ahead.
No, cool. I was just gonna say, so much of what you say really resonates too, because it's not just the transportation, it's the childcare too, right? Like, I can't be here if my husband didn't take my kids to school. Not everyone has that. And so how is this administration is thinking about that aspect of humans too? Like, okay, I could train you for this job, but what are all those other barriers that prevent you from getting there? I mean, we saw our first CHIPS and Science Act NOFO that says, okay, not only do you have to provide childcare for the people who build these CHIPS facilities, but also for the workers that will work there after it's built. I mean, that's huge. There's maternity leave, but then there's like the childcare once the kids are here, and sort of really recognizing all those things that make that playing field a little bit more even to enable everyone to go to work is really important.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we need more training. We need more equitably provided training. We need more support services. We need to have investments in industry partnerships that are going to bring folks together to figure this out in particular sectors, in particular geographic areas. We have a lot of stuff to talk to people about here in Washington over the next couple of days. So as our final question here, most of these folks are going to be going up to the Hill on Wednesday to talk to folks in Congress. They will be talking to folks in the administration as well. But what would you recommend to them? Like, how is it to kind of like, what's the points that you feel could be most effective as they're thinking about how to make that pitch to policymakers here in DC? And I'll go with the former member of Congress first on some of that.
Well, so the House, is the Senate in session this week? The House isn't in session.
Senate's in session.
Senate's in session. So first of all, don't be bummed out to talk to staff. They do all the work. They have the expertise. So the fact that the member in the House may not be there, that's fine. And if the senator's not there, just go for it. And I think one of the most important things you could do is to tell specific stories about specific people in their district or in their state. You're going to go as a state delegation, and really be very concrete about it. And also be very frank about the equity issues. Don't dance around it. Come with numbers, come with data, come with stories to talk to them both about the justice aspects of it and about how we can't have a well-functioning economy unless we get everybody in the game. And we can't afford to be leaving people out because of old prejudices or old ideas. Ultimately, Andy, and this isn't your focus, but there's in big public policy terms, without bringing the 11 million people in the shadows out and having immigration reform, we're not going to have enough workers in this country, and we need to tackle that. And they're cut across many industries, but Lord knows if some of the people working hard as roofers and carpenters could join Melissa's great unions, they would have a good, decent life, and we would have the workforce we need. And the other big thing that I want to say, not to shy away from, is before you go, look at the president's good job standards. They're in the Department of Labor website. They're just less than a page, but they include really great stuff about training and so forth. They also include the freedom to have a dang union if you darn well please without your boss crushing you. And that is, we're not going to rebuild the middle class unless we do that. We're not going to get to equitable jobs unless we do that.
Thanks, Sandy. Stephanie, advice.
Do what he says. No, I think so much of the conversation, at least for us, around the infrastructure bill was like, how does workforce become that member's number one? Because it's not that they didn't care, it's just that there wasn't enough people, like the congressman, who said, okay, do this. This is the number one thing, because behind the scenes, when you're choosing what are the things that end up in that bill, it's got to rise to the top for enough people for it to not hit the cutting room floor. So I think making those connections to the things that your member of Congress really cares about, and maybe that is workforce, maybe that's their number one. Maybe it's the farm bill. So talk about farm workers, and making those connections really matter for that senator or for that member of Congress, and getting it to rise to their top. Sort of where we focus as cities, and you said, cities are at the table now having to prove why it mattered that all that money got down there locally. I mean, talk about how you're connecting those dots between what your workforce boards are doing, what your community colleges are doing to really have that impact come through.
Thanks, Stephanie. Broderick, any advice?
Sure, I'd say that even in the conversations though about the workforce needs, based on where the member is from, the constituency base, the state, whatever, coming back to the beginning of this discussion, how important it is for people to be trained in digital skill. Because for the farm workers, for example, or people who are small businesses in rural communities, the importance of that training to be able to compete in this country and globally cannot be ignored. And Congressman, sometimes we have this debate about equity in terms of using it. In some parts of the country, the use of equity as a way to try to get people to want to invest in all of this and to see it for them is something that can be standoffish or put offish. So it's important to talk about the outcomes, right? If you use your digital skills training in your rural community, it can mean this for you in terms of opportunities that are available to you. Again, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I've been around this town. We've talked about infrastructure for a long time. Never seen these kinds of investments, but let's make sure that people don't say, well, that was kind of a wasted effort.
Thanks, Broderick. And I should mention that even with over $2 billion of investment in digital equity, we still feel that's a down payment. When you're talking about 92% of 155 million jobs in this country,
That's right.
$2.5 billion is not going to get us there. So we will be talking about other legislation that's going to be proposed on the Hill later this week, particularly to address some of those issues, because we feel like we need some other investments to follow on that to come. Melissa, final word from you in terms of what we should be doing this week.
So two things. I think it's important that we invest in existing models that are out there. So for the building trades, we have I think after the Army, we are the largest training provider in the country. And so I think it's important that we are making sure that the federal dollars that are being marshaled and that will be marshaled, that they're going to be used to ensure access to registered apprenticeship programs. We're looking at prevailing wage, which is the floor in terms of the quality of the wages that are there, and looking at how do we make local hire reality, which the federal government can't necessarily tell us what it looks like, but what is a commitment from your congressional representatives to work with your state and local to figure out what that looks like. And then I think the last piece is just around, I think that was the last thing. Oh, I think the last piece is just how can your member of Congress use their bully pulpit to either get their governors to remove any barriers that might exist to good paying union jobs in your jurisdictions. Some states prohibit project labor agreements. And that's a big barrier in terms of really amplifying local and targeted hire. So how can they be a part of that? And then also, how can they make sure that their local partners are working closely on the good jobs piece that are coming through the various federal agencies to implement that at the state and local level as well.
Excellent. So we've got a lot of work to do this week. As everyone up here has said, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and we can't squander it. We can't let the federal government squander it. We can't let our states and cities squander it. But it's going to be up to us who are going to be doing some of the workforce development part of the solution to make sure that our work and our folks are at the table to figure out how that's going to be done effectively. So your voice on that this week is going to be incredibly important. So this is a great start to the Skills Summit on such an important issue, but let's give a round of applause for this amazing panel.
Good job.
All right, everybody sit tight for a minute. We're just going to shift out, and we're going to have one more piece of business to do before we break.
She passed away a few years ago. She was trained in Baltimore at Merville.
Oh, yeah.
And she was a carpenter
Yes.
in the 80s. As
Yes.
one of the first women.
Yep. That's phenomenal. Thank you.
No, you're not. Broderick, you can sit right there.
I should just take it with me.
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone had a wonderful break and maxed out their networking and soft pretzels and have all the energy to join me in a conversation that we're about to have with three really impressive panelists. So we talked a lot in the first plenary about what were some of the pieces of legislation that Congress passed last year, how's the implementation going. In this session, I want to build on that conversation a lot, and as the name suggests, focus heavily on what's happening in DC that's going to both impact how those implementations happen and more practically, your Hill Days on Wednesday. So with that, I want to kick off this session with a video from one of the strongest skills champions we've had in recent years, Senator Baldwin.
Hello, I'm Senator Tammy Baldwin, and it's great to be here, albeit virtually, for this year's National Skills Coalition Summit. I'm happy to join all of you to discuss how we can work together to ensure our workers have the skills and knowledge they need to get good-paying jobs and move our economy forward. We know in our 21st century economy, the ticket to a family-supporting job often means more than a high school diploma. But we also know that a bachelor's degree is expensive and not the only path to secure a job. And right now, as investments from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act begin to roll out, demand for highly skilled workers is only increasing. I've heard from many Wisconsin businesses who are struggling to find the skilled workers they need to maintain and grow their businesses. Businesses are often looking for workers who have specific skill sets that can often be only obtained through credential training. That's why it's critical that we invest in technical colleges, apprenticeships, work-based learning, and public-private partnership training that we need to ensure that workers have the skills they need for today and tomorrow. Skills training not only invests in our workers, but also enhances the productivity, efficiency, and competitiveness of our entire workforce. Working alongside all of you, I am proud to lead the Promoting Apprenticeships through Regional Training Networks for Employers' Required Skills, or Partners Act. I'm leading this in Congress to invest in public-private partnerships, boost apprenticeship programs for workers, and help close the skills gap. This needed legislation would establish a grant program to support the expansion of industry partnerships to help small and medium-sized businesses develop work-based learning programs and provide mentoring and support service for workers. Critical industries that drive our economy, like healthcare, manufacturing, and tech industries, are rapidly changing and need workers that can perform their jobs efficiently and effectively, which is why earlier this year, I was proud to reintroduce the Jobs Act to allow students to use federal Pell Grants so that they can afford high-quality, shorter-term job training programs. Together, we can help more Americans find fulfilling careers and ensure that everyone has the chance to succeed, regardless of their background, level of education, or income. I'm proud to support the National Skills Coalition mission to expand access to high-quality skills training so that more people have access to a better life and a better future. Thank you.
Virtually, I'll thank Senator Baldwin for sharing comments with us and also apologize to everyone in the audience for the amount of time it took for her staffer and I to come up with the partner's name and all the different words that filled in that made up half of the time of her comments. So on that note, I want to bring up the panelists who will be joining me for today's conversation. And I'll give them a second to get on their feet. And I will introduce them to you as they come on stage. So first, Eric Rodriguez, who's the Senior Vice President of Policy at Unidos US. Next, Allison Dembeck, who's Vice President of Education and Labor at the US Chamber and also a board member of National Skills Coalition. And Nicole Barcliff, who's Senior Policy Director of LISC. So thank you all for joining me. We talked a little bit, or made a couple jokes about this maybe a little bit in the first session, about how tumultuous DC might have been recently. And in case there's folks who are coming to the summit wondering if that's the kind of experience that they're gonna have on the Hill on the third day, I want you all to share your experience with it. Because the other side of that question is that maybe it's just less exciting in the news to say that Congress is working business as usual. So a two-part question there, because I also like to get caught up in the drama. First, when you talk a little bit about your priorities, can you all share places where you've seen progress in the first 5 months of this Congress? And as you close out your comments, can you all share with us your favorite story that has captured the news, whether it's about spy balloons or the number of ballots in Speaker McCarthy's election, that has made you feel like maybe DC is a little tumultuous right now? Nicole, I'll start with you.
Hi, Katie. Thank you so much for having us here today. I am from LISC, and our approach to workforce might be a little bit interesting for you guys to hear because we come at it from a community development perspective. And so skills and talent as a pipeline for thriving communities, and we run this integrated service delivery model that bundles income supports, access to employment and contextualized skills training and financial coaching as a secret sauce to help improve people's outcomes in local communities. This is definitely an interesting time to be doing federal affairs. I've been doing it for about 20 years now. And what I'm finding hopeful about this session is in a community development broader context, we're seeing the reintroduction of bipartisan legislation that existed in previous Congresses. So to me, that's a hopeful checkpoint. I think it's a little bit early. I've polled some of my colleagues and said, hey, look at this question. And they were like, are you serious? Does she really want to know what progress we made? And everyone started sweating. Like, should we have stuff done by now? And the realistic answer is, like, it's a little bit early to say we have this win in May right now. And there's a huge bipartisan consensus on the fact that resources are needed to improve outcomes for people. But it is promising to see the bubbling up of authorizing pieces that have been introduced year after year after year and haven't moved, got really close to the finish line. For us, it's on tax policy. So this notion of there's consensus around leveraging both public and private sector resources in order to, expand the reach of federal resources. So we're seeing that slow churn. I'll let maybe some of my other colleagues answer before I go to the second part.
I think a lot of it is news, to be honest. To your point, Katie, it's not that interesting to hear that people are getting along and that there's agreement and there's a path forward. I mean, some of it is real, but there is a lot of consensus. There have been a number of bipartisan bills reintroduced, particularly in the education and labor space. I mean, we just had the College Transparency Act was reintroduced last week, which is strongly bipartisan.
And it's in everyone's agenda.
Yes, and the National Skills Coalition is very supportive of. Senator Baldwin talked about the Jobs Act, which is, short-term Pell, also very bipartisan. We've seen on the Senate side and on the House side, the Appropriations Committee historically is being led by 4 women for the first time ever, which in itself is a huge accomplishment. And all 4 women have come out and said, look, we're going to do this. We're doing this appropriations process and we're going to work together. And they've been holding hands and really trying to move through an actual appropriations process. So I think there are a lot of opportunities. There are other chamber priorities, things like permit streamlining, and that has been really bipartisan. It's been a chance for business and labor organizations to work together, and Republicans and Democrats have come out and recognized the problem in terms of trying to get projects done so that we can then get people out and working. And so I actually am optimistic about it. Now that we've moved past some of the early stage setting of how Congress gets going.
And we've got a question on that later that I would love to hear folks' input on. So Eric, can you talk a little bit about some of the progress that you all have made that makes you optimistic?
Sure. Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Just a minute on Unidos US. We're the nation's largest Latino civil rights organization, and we're unique because we do a lot of programmatic work with our 300 affiliates in addition to public policy work on Capitol Hill and in a few state capitals. And yeah, it's been a crazy ride. I think, look, if you think your issues are hard, try working on immigration reform in a bipartisan fashion for 30 years. We still are hopeful it will happen, but it's a long slog. So we know we've got to have realistic expectations about what we can get out of the Congress. But I would say a couple things. One is, the House Democratic leadership is impressive. This Congress comes in with the largest number of minority lawmakers in history. I think that's quite exciting. So personnel is policy, right? You see it with the guests you have here who are talking about what they're doing at the agencies when they come to these roles of leadership with, the life experience of growing up in a disadvantaged community or being a minority. It makes a big difference. So I think that's been quite successful, is putting people in positions to lead in this difficult time period, and I think it's going to pay dividends over the next 18 months. So I'm really impressed by that. I like that. The tight margin, right, that we're seeing in the House is crazy, but is also very interesting, right? I mean, we're seeing things we wouldn't normally see, like, House Speaker vote 15 rounds. That's incredible, right? We've never seen that. But at the same time, there could be some movement, if you get 5 or 6 members interested in something bipartisan, right? Even immigration measures may, in fact, if you can get a few members who are willing to step out on it on the Republican side, you might see something happen. So that's pretty interesting. The one story I'll just relay if we want to get that piece kickstarted, I heard
Thank you for
I'll keep
indulging my
names.
question.
Of course, I'll keep names anonymous so you don't know who's that. But a good colleague of mine was mentioning he was talking to a member of Congress who was talking to his staffer and saying, well, we need to do 1, 2, 3. And the staffer looked up at him and said, Mr. Congressman, I'm on my break.
Oh, wow. Okay, so
And
job
moved
quality
on.
issues have been covered.
Yes, how things have changed in the Congress. Certainly 20, 25 years ago, you'd never heard that. So, it's a new environment and a new world, a better world for sure. But things are changed.
I like what you described about it taking really only 5 or 6 members who are interested in something to advance policy. I think that's one of the things that makes the advocacy that folks are going to be doing on Wednesday so important, because it's through the conversations that members are having with you all where we get the 5 or 6 champions who you'll see in videos this week who are now committed to skills. So Eric, can I dig in a little bit to one of the things that you were mentioning, which was Speaker McCarthy's election process took more ballots than any speaker in history. What does that mean, or does it mean anything, for progress in the role of leadership in the House?
Well, certainly, and again, we are seeing some unprecedented things, but the fact that the speaker was able to rally the caucus around a debt ceiling proposal tells you that the speaker has power and can do things, right, and can bring his caucus together and unite. There's a lot we don't know, so we're trying to read a lot of the tea leaves together, but I think, our initial starting point was, boy, this is going to be a real bumpy ride, as we move along, because imagining, each individual caucus and some of the rules and concessions that the speaker had to make to secure votes makes you really worry about the ability to pass serious legislation in a bipartisan fashion, or even a partisan fashion for that matter. So I think there were initially a lot of worries, but if he's able to find ways to work together to get his caucus to rally behind him on an important signature proposal that's positioning, the House to negotiate with the President or the Senate, then maybe it can happen. So I'm reading those and trying to figure out what it means for the future, but we don't know a lot, but we know some things can happen.
And one of the things, going back to the collegiality that you all either mentioned or referred to, is that it sounds like Leader Jeffries and Speaker McCarthy have a good relationship. Is that, and this is open to anyone, is that going to change the tenor of activity in the House, especially post-debt ceiling, or does that matter?
I think that you alluded to this earlier when you first started speaking about this public perception of what goes on in DC and then actually what's happening. So I think that over the years, with increased access to media and across different platforms, people just get a reinforcement of the dysfunction and that nothing gets done. When in reality, there are very few Congresses where nothing gets done. There's always work and deals behind the scene. And there's always a demand for accountability for elected officials from their constituencies. So I think that the public reporting and even some of the behind-the-scenes observations of the speaker and the leader getting along is hopeful, because that means that the medium that's normally the most negative about dysfunction in DC is actually picking up on some functionality, which means, in my hopeful nature, there's probably a little bit more going on behind the scenes. So I encourage folks to not go into this with a defeatist attitude. I think the other thing that we have to pay attention to is that we're coming out of a very serious pandemic in this country, and a reckoning, a racial reckoning, an equity-based reckoning. We've got everything on the table, health and relations. And that still is very true and at the forefront of the minds of elected officials and staff. So I think that these leaders know that they have to address some of these issues and move agendas forward that actually produce results because communities are still kind of struggling to rebound.
I think what you've said about remembering about the pandemic is a particularly interesting thing. And I don't mean this as commentary on the pandemic one way or another, but something to think about when you all go into your meetings tomorrow is that as I'm managing coalitions and I'm trying to set up Hill meetings, the Republicans always want to meet in person. They do not want to meet over Zoom. They expect you're going to show up in the office. The Democrats, it's a little dependent, you know, especially if it's a Monday or a Friday or if it's recess. I am much more likely to get a request to do a meeting over Zoom.
Or if they're on their break.
Or if they're on their break, right? But I'm much more likely to get a request over Zoom. Now, that's a matter of personal preference. I'm not saying one is a negative or a positive, but it also does mean as you're going in to do these meetings, there is a difference in how people have viewed the pandemic and what that means for meetings and how they're going to approach some of the conversations you're going to have. So it's just probably a good idea to keep that in mind when you do your meetings.
That's such a good point. And one of the things that I wanted to dig in, so if your meetings happen to be in the Senate, as a former Senate staffer, building on what we were talking about on the dynamics of leadership on the House side, how do you see this impacting where the Senate is able to go with some of the progress or roadblocks that the House throws up?
Yeah, so the Senate is in an interesting place, right? I mean, it actually is the body that requires consensus. You need 60 votes. As you said, as a former Senate staffer, I feel very strongly about those 60 votes. I think that makes better legislation than majority rule. So, you know, I'm a fan of keeping that. I think, though, that it means that there has to be some real conversations. You can't just blame things on Senator Manchin or Senator Sinema, or in the case of trying to figure out whether or not we're going to be able to get a vote on the new Secretary of Labor, Senator Tester, right? So, I mean, there's 3 people, but it does matter. I mean, if you're in West Virginia and what you're telling Senator Manchin, it's going to be different than, you know, what you're going to be telling a senator from California or a senator from Washington State, or it just is, and you could all be Democrats, but it's not the same thing. And so I think that it's not one party or the other. I mean, it's been pretty public about some of the differences between Senator McConnell and Senator Scott and the views of what Republican leadership should look like and who people, so there are problems all the way around. But that 60 votes is particularly important. With Senator Feinstein, she's sick, right? So she's been in the hospital. So there is no leeway. Democrats can't lose a vote. So it does change what then gets brought to the floor.
That's a great point. And so thinking about the conversation that we've already had, I really loved what you all were saying about the connection between one of the pieces of progress that we've seen this year is some of the folks who have joined the administration, potentially joining at leadership spots in the administration as the Senate moves forward to potentially confirm the new Secretary of Labor. I want to go back a little bit to the initial conversation that Andy was having with the folks earlier to talk about where you've seen the implementation of CHIPS, of the Inflation Reduction Act, of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, impacting the constituents and the networks with whom you all work. And then kind of building on that, what does that mean for the progress that can happen in DC to build on those bills?
Yeah, you know, I thought about this in your first question about progress, and I was like, well, can we look retrospectively and call on some of the progress that we saw? From our perspective, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act included some digital skills pieces that were phenomenal and that really speak to this divide in accessing resources that get people actually connected to not only skills, but to healthcare. I mean, if you step back from a global perspective, you know, digital access means a lot. I think that seeds like that came from prior pieces of legislation that are still being implemented in local communities and that we don't have infinite resources for are good, hopeful points that we could pull forward to try to include, you know, in priorities for congressional leaders, right? And so kind of drawing from some of those past wins from the last Congress that had seeds of partnership and real impact in local communities, I think makes me very hopeful. And I think it also makes, kind of building on something that you said, Allison, this notion of contextualizing message for your member, right? And so this notion of what happens on the ground and how the resources are being deployed or how need is represented from your state, from your district, becomes infinitely important in terms of pushing an agenda forward. So I think that, you know, there's a whole lot going on. There's some stuff from the past that can provide seeds of hope, and then there's some actual on the ground, I think, knowledge that all of you have from partnering with entities and communities that could be instructive.
It is one of the most common questions we get all the time is, what is happening with the bipartisan infrastructure law on the ground? What is happening as folks are getting ready to think about the investments that are made or credits that are available under the Inflation Reduction Act? What does that mean then for businesses in certain areas? And so being able, what I hear you describing is being able to bring those stories to your members is useful as far as raising up skills issues. It's also useful insofar as helping to paint that picture in an even different way for the member and staff.
So to that point, right, so in talking about the infrastructure bill, and it was mentioned earlier, one of the things that is, you know, it's a positive thing. There's a focus on childcare and this idea of trying to make sure that people who are getting the money are providing childcare, which conceptually is great. But one of the things that we're hearing from our state and local chambers or from our businesses is that those childcare options aren't available. And so there's concern about how do you apply for this money? How do you say you want it? How do you be the applicant? How do you win the award if you can't actually physically meet that requirement, right? So it's us trying to help our state and local chambers and our companies on the ground figure out ways that maybe they can, you know, meet that requirement, but also if that is something that is an issue, make sure that you're telling your member of Congress, like actually explain it, like explain how many child care slots there are, explain how many actual child care facilities there are, explain how, you know, there's a shortage of actual child care workers because maybe there could be more slots, but there aren't enough people to actually work in the child care facility to open up those slots. It's a complicated thing. So while the concept is great, there are some real implementation difficulties that cascade down that it's important that your members of Congress hear about.
Because that is then how we get support for the proposals to build on that success, like the digital equity recommendations that Andy referenced in the first plenary. Mm-hmm. Eric, how have you seen the folks in your network and the administration working together for some of the implementation of some of these bills, and then what does that mean for the work back here?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, you know, a couple things are important by way of context, right? This is the fastest and most robust recovery from an economic shock that we've ever seen in history, right? If you look at what's been happening. And at the same time, the administration has made racial equity a priority in a theme which is extremely hard to do, to make that kind of pivot. And there are some good examples of where this has taken place in the last 2 years. If you look at the healthcare subsidies and the healthcare system and health equity, the gains that have been made there are tremendous. So I think when the dust is settled, people will look very much at what HHS has been doing and on the healthcare side and how much success the administration has had. The second is the earned income tax credit and child tax credit campaigns that significantly reduced child poverty in the last 2 years and did so in an equitable way with many partners. So they're creating new playbooks on how to operationalize equity in government. And these pieces of legislation that they intend to implement to our varying stages of implementation have strong equity requirements in them. The hope is that they're going to replicate some of what the administration has learned in the first 2 years, so we can assure, if nothing else, that we protect many of the gains that have been made in the last 2 years by these resources, but also, of course, set us up for future continued growth. And that means significantly changing the way government works in these days. It's going to be a great challenge. It has been a challenge to this point. It will challenge the implementation and the ability to get resources into the field, and that's where we have And many other civil rights groups have been partners, whether it's on digital equity, which has a clear-cut mandate, or in places like climate and environmental justice, which is probably going to take more time to really arrive at where I think we want it to go.
Can I dig in a little bit there? And then, Nicole, I imagine you might have thoughts on this as well with your network's connection to community development and economic development. Eric, you mentioned the impact of having strong equity provisions in parts of the bills that have then translated. For example, folks may have applied or looked at some of the funding available under the Department of Transportation, where there were significant requirements to explain the plans of how the funding was going to support communities of color and disadvantaged communities, as well as bring in folks who haven't historically been able to access the pipeline into those good transportation jobs. Some of this is the bipartisan recognition of the importance there. Some of it also is the leadership of the administration. So 2 years ago, they signed the executive order advancing racial equity, and then also focused on disadvantaged communities. And in your answer, I don't want to assume, but are you seeing the impact of that kind of executive action on the ground?
Well, I think in the places where they had a mandate and urgency, and that's why I lifted up the healthcare tax credits, the healthcare provisions that kept many on the rolls throughout the pandemic and the emergency, the Medicaid rolls. So those were all places where the impact was almost immediate on people and on families and on kids. Nutrition assistance would be another, where it was clear-cut. And that's why I think the administration has latched onto these places that directly benefit families and kids and help with affordability and costs, because they've seen how directly engagement through the tax system or otherwise can have that kind of impact. I think the others that have a longer kind of tail, right? They've got to go through the entire policymaking system, get out to the states, find their way to people, are places that are going to take more time. And that's why I'm mentioning some of the provisions for whom there is that long kind of tail, and a lot can get lost in between, the intentions and the families receiving those benefits. And we particularly work on behalf of hard-to-reach families, right? We're talking about immigrant families with U.S. kids. We're talking about non-English speakers. We're talking about many of the people and workers that you all serve here. You know how hard it is to reach those families, so that implementation has to be done right. And that's why part of what I'm saying about the playbook is it involves groups. It involves a process of deeply engaging community organizations that are serving those families to make sure that implementation happens right. And that doesn't always happen. So I think it's kind of our task to make sure we're reminding and underscoring the importance of collaboration.
And the ongoing need of it beyond just this time and place when we start implementation. Nicole, are you seeing the impact of that executive action in the communities with whom you work?
So yes and no, and here's where a little bit of Debbie Downer comes in. And so I think that we need to stay vigilant. I think that the executive order did a wonderful thing of forcing agencies to take an internal look at how they do business. LISC, our Financial Opportunity Center network, really does focus on the hard to serve, hard to employ folks, the folks who are traditionally just outside of the workforce development system. And so in looking at racial equity, and this was a long walk, but I'm gonna bring you with me. In looking at racial equity, oftentimes people automatically jump to, and it's natural, to local communities and individuals, right? But there's a layer of social support there that's also a part of this equity conversation. And you alluded to this in terms of those community-based organizations. And so when those organizations, for lots of different reasons, rooted in equity and systemic injustice, fall outside of the public system of financial support, you then see a transfer of difficulty and increased inequity for the populations they serve. And so there's a piece of there. We've been yelling for many years that if you want to support the hard to serve, the hard to employ, you have to start resourcing those community-based organizations that are not getting traditional funding streams or that don't have the infrastructure in place to apply for federal funding, and in some cases don't have infrastructure in place to apply for philanthropic resources either. And so leveraging LISC as an intermediary, and where we can, in our networks, we try to support CBOs, but I think that this is a lesson for the federal government, both on the congressional side and in agencies, to take a really hard look at what they're doing with federal and public resources, and are they really going to those groups that kind of cradle the most vulnerable and get them ready for public supports. The other thing that I'll flag, and this is really important for those of you that are going into offices of individuals I'll call who have challenges with equity framing. We're starting to see a slow backlash to the use of the word equity.
Yeah, and
right?
Broderick mentioned that this morning, absolutely.
Yeah, and so it's concerning. But facts are hard to argue with. So I would encourage everyone, and this is where your local context and the impact of the programming comes into play and data come into play, to rely on facts and to rely on those stories, coupled with the stories, to help kind of bolster and keep the conversation around what it means to promote equity alive. It's really hard to argue against equity when you're pointing to a community-based organization or nonprofit in someone's district that is connecting people to skills and jobs. It's an equity argument, and I don't think we should give up on talking about it. I think we double down and message it in a way that hopefully can bring more people around to be less averse to approaches that champion equity.
Do you have any examples, any quick thoughts, any successes for when you've been able to do that successfully in a meeting?
You know, honestly, I always say that I'm only as smart as my programmatic counterparts that are partnering with the local organizations that are providing services. Like, folks really don't want to hear from me, right?
Yeah. They don't want to hear from any of us.
Yes.
That's why we're on the stage together,
Yes.
so we can talk.
Because we're friends. This is really a support group right here for each other, because no one really wants to talk to us. But there's some truth to having success of bringing either an individual or a story or an organization directly to staff and or a member, and making that connection that links to a federal program.
Yep. I really thought I was going to make it through this whole panel without saying this, but that goes back to the adage of data makes you credible, stories make you memorable, and now we need a third line there about, and when you're telling an equity story. Right. Allison, what about you?
So sometimes too, because I completely agree with what you're saying, that equity, the moment you mention equity in some offices, they're not interested in having a further conversation, right? I'll use the College Transparency Act as a perfect example, because the U.S. Chamber partners with the Association of Publicly Land-Grant Universities, so one of the schools, New America, and the Institute for Higher Education Policy, right? And so you've got civil rights, you've got schools, you've got the business community, going into some offices, and IHIP is all about the reason, and New America is all about the reason why this is important is because it's an equity issue, and we need to make sure that all students are having access to outcomes on higher education because it's an equity issue. And they're right.
Which is what CTA would do, right? Just for folks who may not have heard us talk about it.
Right, and that's what the College Transparency Act, that's what CTA would do. It would allow the connection of data in a safe way, data that schools already have or the federal government already has, allows that connection so that people can actually make knowledgeable decisions on their return on investment on higher education, right? That's the whole idea, and it is an equity issue. But you go into certain offices and you say it's an equity issue, they are not going to be interested. So you say, well, it's a skills gap issue. It's a way that employers can, help figure out where to recruit, or where people can figure out what programs to study, because they can see where they're getting hired and what the wages are. So you're coming at it, it's still an equity issue, not necessarily using the word equity, but you're talking the language that office very likely is going to be willing to talk. Still getting at that issue, not shying away from it, just reframing it in a language that can bring them along.
And folks will have talking points with equity-based talking points that folks will go over in a session tomorrow as well. And so I want to build a little bit and put you on the spot, Allison, with College Transparency Act. but then I'd really love Eric and Nicole, you all to share whether this is true or not outside of. So WIOA is technically up for reauthorization. The bill that runs or administrates our public workforce system, the Higher Education Act, is technically could be up for reauthorization. We've also then got things that I'm gonna sound less despondent when I mention, like the Farm Bill, potential tax packages and appropriations bill. Maybe the despondency snuck back in there. But so when you're talking about College Transparency Act and progress there, we're making the assumption, right, that this is not progress through a wholesale HEA reauthorization. No. So does it change the tactic or the conversation that you all are having with offices when what we're talking about on some of these pieces is how do they relate to a larger package that's going to address some sort of economic policy? How do we talk about skills or tax credits or within the context, for example, Eric, of immigration? How are we thinking about the larger tax package and helping members dig into, and this is something that Stephanie was mentioning on the first panel, take these proposals in a massive package and make it the thing that they are going to ride their support on?
So it's a couple of things, right? Education in particular is one of those, and I'm oversimplifying, but education in particular is one of those areas where basically there are 6 bills, right? You've got your early childhood, your child care development block grant and Head Start. You've got your Every Student Succeeds, your K through 12 bill. You've got your Career and Tech Ed bill, Perkins Career and Tech Ed. You've got the Higher Education Act, and you've got WIOA, Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act. It is not impossible, and there are a few other things floating around, you know, the Education, Research and Sciences Act and a few other things, but it's not impossible. But chances are, College Transparency Act or the Jobs Act, whatever the short-term Pell bill ends up being, like those things aren't gonna pass on their own. Even the apprenticeships bills aren't likely to pass on their own. They're gonna pass alongside a WIOA, or they're gonna pass as part of a defense reauthorization bill at the end of the year because everybody uses it as a Christmas tree and hangs their pieces of legislation on it as it goes through, right? And that's just the way it is. But that's also okay. And not only is it okay, in some ways it's actually, I would argue it's actually better because you're not having a individual floor fight on every single pro and con of a particular bill. You're having your champions go and talk to the other members of Congress. You're having the staffers who really work on these bills and really know them in and out, talk with other staffers who really know and work on them. And it's not that those conversations don't happen, but you're not airing your dirty laundry about the bill on the floor so that then people end up skeptical about what it is that they're gonna see, because the reality is every bill is gonna have pros and cons. You don't need to air that dirty laundry. And so there's a recognition, right? And there should be a recognition. It's not gonna go on its own. But part of the reason why things like co-sponsorship, right? Co-sponsorships of the Jobs Act or the College Transparency Act or those things are important because if there isn't strong bipartisan co-sponsorship, those bills won't get attached, right? The committee leadership, both the House, the chairs and the ranking members, they will look and they'll be like, you know what? There's only 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats. Obviously, this isn't something people care about. We don't need to attach it. But if you have 100 Republicans and 100 Democrats, well, you know, now you're actually talking about a large number of House members. Maybe we do actually have to consider it. And so that's why it's important.
And that's a good reference back too. Would the same be true if you had 150 co-sponsors in every single meeting that folks are gonna be doing on Wednesday? Nicole or Eric?
You know, so yes to all of that, right? Because I know I'm done. No. The one thing that I would seize on is that details matter. And when we think about large legislative packages and we think about dropping bills into large legislative packages, sometimes it's not the whole bill. So that's why it's important to kind of talk to staff and tell that story about you may not be an expert on all parts of a large piece of legislation, but that one piece that you have data for that affects your local community, tell that story, present that data, and you'd be surprised. I think that pieces of bills within bills end up moving, even if the whole piece of legislation doesn't move itself. So you have like a big vehicle, a big package that's going somewhere, and you may not get writ large WIOA reauthorization dropped into whatever vehicle is moving, but you may get a segment of something in
Gosh,
there.
I'm so workforce focused. I was describing WIOA as the massive bill. That wasn't gonna go. I see you laughing at me, but yes.
No, but there's a piece, it's like bills within bills within bills. And the other piece that I'd hone in on is that farm bill, talk about bipartisanship, right? Yeah. That's like the cash cow, is that bad? Is that like, that's slow farm, it's like the Christmas tree, yeah. So Farm Bill really presents a good opportunity where folks are already at the table, I think, in a bipartisan fashion because of this emphasis on rural America and rural supports and rural economies, which are extremely important. But tucked in Farm Bill, like most other places, are aspects of all of the things that we all care about. There's child care aspects that can be tucked into Farm Bill. There's employment and workforce access. Think about SNAP employment and training as a talking point. And there's bills out right now, I think it's the Reset America's Futures Act, which expands SNAP employment and training funding. And so this is me with my eye towards hard to serve, hard to employ, meeting people where they are and seizing onto this like, hey, here's this big bipartisan piece that's moving, and here's something else that you could tuck into it, I think is an important thing to keep in mind.
Absolutely, because part of why you have that bipartisan chip at the table, right, is because it's a must-pass bill this year.
Yes.
And so they know that they can't hold out.
Right.
Eric, what about you?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, taking a practical perspective, you know, getting in there and doing the educational work, you know, talking about how these programs impact people are all things that have to be done and have great value. The committees may be doing more work than people see, right? Because there's all the fighting that's supposed to take place and all the noise, because some assume that that's what their voters expect from them, right? To come to Congress and fight. But there certainly are lots of evidence that at the committee level, work is being done, right? And so if you happen to be visiting, you know, members of Congress who sit on relevant committees, you have a good shot, I think, of having a decent conversation, and you should be prepared for that. The next couple of years, of course, is all about trying to figure out what we call proximate goals. How do we move a little closer to moving legislation? We have a chance to try to influence the conversation in the presidential debates and in the elections, and making sure we have the right kinds of messages, that the platforms of both parties have our ideas in them, right? Those are things that we'll all be working toward, and sometimes dropping legislation is a way to do that, right? To get your idea out there and to build support for it. The only other thing I would say is that we also have to pay attention to the threats around narratives that are out there, because it stands a chance to undermine support for what you want. You take the Farm Bill, for example. One of the biggest pieces of the Farm Bill is SNAP, right? If we lose the fight in the debt ceiling over work requirements for nutrition programs or for others, our chances of getting where we want to go in a major area is lost. If we lose the argument that equity is good and the right kind of investment by government, because the narrative out there is that it's the reason why we have inflation, well, then we're going to have a hard time really passing a lot of the things that we care about. So the fight over the debt ceiling is about what storyline you believe, right, and what has to happen next. It is very relevant to all the things that we care about. So I think as we're thinking about the narrow program area or several program areas or what our interests are, we have to continuously keep an eye on how that conversation is unfolding. We especially do, because we work on behalf of immigrants, and the border and border security continues to be an explosive issue that undermines support for immigrants all across the board. Immigrants who are here legally, immigrants who are here working very, very hard. And what we want to talk about, you know, there is worker shortages and the fact that we have all of these workers that if we bring them out of the shadows can play a much, much bigger role if we unleash their economic potential. So why don't we do that, right? So how are we going to get all these infrastructure projects done without addressing and stabilizing our immigrant labor force? So I think, so that's how we're linking what is a current set of contrasting political conversations to legislation that's very meaningful to us, and we hope to make advancements on.
And that linkage is so interesting. Now I'm going to ask you all a future-facing question. And to give everyone in the audience a heads up, after I ask folks to go through answers here, we'll turn the questions over to you. We've got about 10 minutes for Q&A, so if you've got an answer, get your hand up. We probably won't get to too many. So in that answering that question, you all invoked a few of the big themes that people are going to run into on the Hill and in advocacy on Wednesday, right? The debt limit, which is obviously going to be a huge conversation point. The House having just passed Speaker McCarthy's package that would expand work requirements, that would address a lot of other insecurities and make things worse for people, while at the same time responding to the debt limit crisis that the Speaker is negotiating with the President and his own caucus over. We talked a little bit about the Farm Bill, another must-pass piece of legislation. And then just to add another twist to all of it, Eric, you mentioned the fact that next year is a presidential election year. Sure. So in the 7 months left this year and potentially next year, when we're sitting back here a year from now, what is the big thing that will have been accomplished that we will be talking about on this stage, or could be? Yeah. So I would... Nicole and Eric's going to be looking at you.
Everybody's looking at me. All right. Okay, so next year we're not going to be talking about the debt limit because they will have passed something. Again, they need 60 votes, right? So we know it's not going to be what the House passed because that's never going to get 60 votes. But we're also not going to be talking about it next year because they will have done that this year, right? So it's front and center right now, but it won't be. I actually think that there's some reason to believe that maybe what we are talking about in this group ends up being something more like WIOA. WIOA has historically been done in the presidential congressional years.
That's such a good point.
Mm-hmm. So it is, I mean, and it is historically really bipartisan. It is something that both parties go back and talk about very different things about why they like it. But it gives everybody a good talking point. And so I think especially coming back out of the pandemic, talking about the issues that we have in terms of filling the jobs that are here, looking at some of these other things, I actually think that this group is going to be talking about WIOA.
That's a tough one. I'm going to take it higher level because I'm not sure. I don't like being wrong, so I don't want to throw out a legislation.
I won't remind you what you said, yeah.
I think that next year we're going to be talking about how things did not fall completely apart this year. I feel like we've been in this crisis mode for so long that all of our political conversations are about impending doom. And I think that we're still recovering from that, but I think that next year we'll likely be talking about something hopeful going forward. So there's a lot of money out on the street for recovery resources that is set to expire or sunset. I think next year we'll be talking about how to leverage the progress that we've made with those resources and to push for permanency and or like new ideas. So I'm not going to go specific on it, but I do think that next year, hopefully, we won't be having doomsday scenario type conversations.
You're saying I'm not going to need to include in every question. Tell me what you're optimistic about. It'll be more natural. Okay.
I think that's the key, which is I'm hopeful, but I'm not optimistic. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the things that you can see happening are really with the administration, right?
Yep.
So the hope is that the implementation of some of the big things, the money moves out to the partners are identified, that there's an equitable group of partners at the table that they're working with. That all of that, I think, whether we're talking about digital or we're talking about other big initiatives, I think all of those will be great things. The issues that, for me, fundamentally something has to change in the environment to see something big, I think, and there could be, right? We have a very active and unpredictable Supreme Court. Cases could come, decisions could be made, affirmative action could turn this way, DACA could turn that way, and all of a sudden you have a moment to pass a bill, right, in a bipartisan. You don't know, you just don't know. So there's just a lot of things that are not clear, but it just feels to me something has to change in the environment for, and unfortunately there are things happening, whether it's unfortunately gun violence and crime and other pressures that are building for Congress to act now, that in fact could lead to bipartisan efforts along the way. And hopefully we can say that the Congress found a way to work together to solve a problem, at least one, please, over the next year, right? So we'll see.
So we have both a low bar and no precise answers. No, that's not, we said WIOA. Yes, okay, perfect. So I'll turn to folks in the audience. Do we have any questions teed up? If not, I'll keep going up mine.
Oh, somebody's got one back there.
And I know we've got mic runners. I don't want to be missing that you all are standing next to someone. Do we have a question back there?
Great, thank you all. My question is for Nicole. I appreciated the point you made about how when we have a system where the hardest to serve are often being served by CBOs, less so than sort of our public sector workforce system, and that really can kind of deepen inequity in important ways that are not good. I'd be curious to hear from you a little bit about what do you see as a policy fix for that? Because in so many ways, we have policy that has statute that says we're supposed to be kind of reaching the hard to serve, and yet we know in practice that because of how things work with procurement or other things that that's not happening. So I think it's an excellent point, and I'd love to hear your thinking on what does policy look like that helps make that change?
So I think that, and thank you, that's an excellent question. So there's a couple of things. I think that we tuck away resources for community-based organizations in different places that are often, and if we take workforce and talent development and skills training as the platform, they're not always in those major funding streams for skills and or workforce. So I think, one, we have to kind of step back and take a look at those authorizing streams and ask ourselves, are community-based organizations, are there capacity building resources embedded in those existing funding streams that would start the conversation of integrating CBOs into that framework? That's one. The second policy piece, and that's a legislative fix, which quite honestly we know takes a long time, it takes a lot of explaining, and it doesn't mean that we don't do that, but I think that that's a conversation to be had. The hopeful part for me is on, with this administration, on the agency sides of things, there is an edict to look at capacity building for BIPOC organizations that are BIPOC-led. For all of this is connected. So when we talk about racial equity and socioeconomic equity, I think oftentimes people think about BIPOC-led organizations as being beneficiaries of some of those policies. So when we talk about making federal contracts more competitive for those types of entities, like that's a fix, right? So moving agencies to think about channeling their resources that way. And agencies are taking internal looks at that to kind of meet the demands of that racial equity orders. The other piece is that, and I can't believe I didn't say this earlier, and my colleagues are probably killing me, like use intermediaries. We often have a conversation that micro-organizations, like small CBOs, you may not want them going in for these big funding contract opportunities because the capacity is not there. They need dollars to support their infrastructure and their work. But there may be a way to kind of leverage intermediary organizations like LISC, and there's plenty others out there. So looking at policies that actually channel resources to groups that can then fund CBOs or build their capacity, I think is important. And then thirdly, I'll say like looking at dollars that are in other places. So for example, there's a capacity building program at HUD that goes to community-based organizations through intermediaries. You think about HUD, you're like, is there really kind of overlap with like skills training and workforce? But I call communities the places with mirrors, because the same entities are touching folks, whether they're looking for housing support, they're looking for workforce support, they're looking for childcare. And so looking in existing programming or existing funding streams now to see whether or not CBOs that are doing skills training or workforce supports would be eligible beneficiaries of those existing programs for capacity building, I think is a valuable thing. And we can go on and on. There are tucked into different legislative proposals. There's a nod towards capacity building, but I think that we don't talk about that aspect enough.
I see someone point, here. There we go.
Thank you. I want to pick up something Ms. Rodriguez said about the need to set a narrative and how if we don't set the narrative, that's what you do really matters. And that seems obvious to me. But when I listen to everyone up on the panel, there were several places where the advice was to concede the narrative, be it on not talking about equity with certain people or referring to the debt ceiling crisis, which is made up. Like, in a situation where vast swaths of the country believe things that are not just reasonable people can disagree, but are factually untrue, what are we doing to actually set the proper narrative so we can actually advance goals beyond fighting for crumbs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll open it up to Eric.
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. I think that's exactly right. Well, one thing about having a divided Congress, which is overall, that is actually a moderating force, right? Which is you can have some extreme elements and conversation and communications and legislation on the one hand, but if you want to get something out of the Congress, it has to look very different, and there's the opportunity. Right, so where you have an entity that's really pushing a more extremist set of policies and an agenda, you also have a Senate that's prepared to be in a different position. And that whatever that position is, that should be, those are your champions, right? Those are your places to begin to work toward moderating some of those policies in the way that you want to, or winning the war around narrative that you want is by empowering those champions to be saying the things that you think are important. But that's exactly right. That's the zone we're getting into, which is we're going to have two parties with two contrasting views of the world, right? And the world that they live in heading into an election next year. And I think part of the question for many of us, and many of us who are voting or registering people to vote or getting out there, is how close is that vision to what we believe in? And for civil rights organization is where do civil rights fit into that narrative and equity that's going to be so important? And what role can we play in making sure that it has a very positive narrative, or the people we care about are respected in the process?
And I'll add that in some ways it's also why your individual story is so important. If you're going in and telling a broad story or a broad narrative, that's not your individual experience. And that is something that is a lot easier for a staffer or a member of Congress who disagrees with you to push back on. But if you're going in and saying, I couldn't hire, I've had this job opening for 6 months, and I've had all of these people apply, but none of them have the skills that I'm looking for. This is what I'm looking for. I went to the community college and told them I needed, them to change 2 or 3 classes to get this certificate so that I could have the right skills, and the community college isn't able to do that. Like, go in with the story specific, and I'm not making that story up, that I had a member company say this to me, right? Then I can go in, they may not, and if you don't feel comfortable telling that story, there are 4 people up here that you can tell that story to, and we can anonymize it for you, right? And so that is the benefit of a place like National Skills Coalition or the Chamber or UNIDOS or LISC, right? Like we can anonymize it for you, but it doesn't have as much of an impact, right? The moment we anonymize it, it's not going to be as impactful. But that specific story is a lot harder to refute and isn't being taken as a challenge to their personal beliefs. It is being taken as a story of what it is you are experiencing.
That's a great point. We have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Good afternoon, everyone. So we've talked about how do we service the marginalized populations in workforce development, and I want to specifically ask about how can we address the needs of individuals returning from correction facilities. It's a huge barrier. That's a whole subset of the population that the opportunity is closed off to. So I'm sorry, I'm passionate about it for so many reasons. If you have a background, you can't get housing, you can't get a job. Most people, you can't get assistance. A lot of men, right, and even women returning from corrections facilities, it's so many barriers. How do we address that from the policy level? And I don't even know if I'm asking it the right way, but I'm asking it. I had to put it out there. I had to say something. We got to address it. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's true. So we've never talked about this, but when we talk about compartmentalized funding for different approaches, when people think about people returning to communities from incarceration, policy-wise, most people go to Second Chance Act, right? Immediately. That's where all the programs live for that, and it's segmented, right? You have WIOA programs that should probably be serving those populations, but then you get to, that's a hard to serve, hard to employ special need population. This gets back to stop having staff and members think about community context, right? As opposed to individual funding streams and programmatic context. So if they aren't gonna put REO, the reentry program, into WIOA, which is a proposal that's out there, it's not currently part of WIOA. If they're not, then there should be an eye towards alignment, and we can tell those stories, right? And we can talk about how you haven't reauthorized Second Chance Act in a while, and these resources go to support individuals and entities returning to local communities. It's a workforce issue. Like, it's okay to talk about things that aren't necessarily directly in. You don't want to overload the ask, but you can make connections between different funding streams. And folks like to think about alignment. I think that there's a part of craft that goes to keeping things separate, because when it's time to slice, sometimes you save programs when they're not all coupled into a same place, but then you risk the silo approach for not having adequate resources or having one system and implementation, not view this population as, you know, that's not my thing. Those aren't, you know, that's not what I get dollars to pursue. That belongs over there from another source. So I think that there's part of the conversation has to be with making members and staff aware that individuals returning from incarceration are part of the local communities that we serve. The community-based organizations that are supporting workforce are actually trying and attempting to serve these programs. And what kind of alignment can we have, like, that kind of marry the effectiveness of programs that might be funded in from different channels?
And I know to 100%, and to kind of add on to that, the Society for Human Resource Managers, SHRM, has a toolkit for employers on how to go about, how to go about hiring practices. They've done a lot of studying on this. They've partnered with a number of other organizations, including the U.S. Chamber and a number of other businesses. It is something that, as employers yourselves, you should take a look at, because there are good suggestions. It is something to share as you're having these conversations with your members of Congress about what does it actually mean to hire people who are returning after incarceration, when they're re-entering the community. It's important, right? Like, we all know that it's important. There's been so many studies. So just, there are resources that we can take advantage of that are out there, and there are legislative changes, and it's just important to make sure we're taking advantage of all of those.
Very well said. So I want to give each of you a last word while we recollect the mics, and then also encourage folks to follow up through the conference app, where you've got the contact information for all of the speakers today. So Eric, I'll start with you. Where would you leave folks as they go up to the Hill on Wednesday?
Well, it's great to see you all and to be here in person. It's wonderful. I think that coming into DC, meeting with your lawmakers, I used to work on the Hill. I know how important it is to do that. And as I used to tell folks, what I learned there is that anybody can walk into an office and ask for anything from their member of Congress, and you should feel empowered to do so. Your voice is very strong and very powerful, and I hope you great success as you're having your visits. Again, it's a tough environment, but there are things that can happen, and contributions that can be made. And so hopefully you see the value of that. You get a lot of good feedback from folks on the Hill, and you can make some real progress in some key areas. I have never, in the years I've been doing this work, seen workers have as much power as they have now to some degree. So I don't know if you all see it the same way, but I certainly do see it. And for those of you who represent those workers and those workers looking to do more with their skills and talent, I think you have a voice that is quite powerful. So anytime we can be an ally on any of that, we hope to do so. Many of our affiliates are running workforce programs, have done quite a bit over the years, and are strong allies. So I know we'll be in solidarity. So thank you.
I would just say don't go in making with presumptions about the office you're meeting with, or if you weren't planning on going to your office because you thought, oh, that member doesn't agree with you, go in and have the conversation. It's really important, and have fun with it, because the staff, they're there because they care, you're here because you care. You can end up disagreeing at the end of the day, or you and the member if you're meeting with the member, but just have fun with it and don't make assumptions about where that conversation is going to go.
That is exactly what I was going to say. Don't, oftentimes, particularly if we hear the narrative reinforced about how dysfunctional things are, or how dug in certain political parties are. Each office is a case-by-case basis, and I don't think any of us would be in the work this long if you didn't have a degree of hope of a fresh slate each time you go into the door. And so it's not no until you're told no. And actually, they will never tell you no most of the time. There's a nice long way of dragging out no, but it's very difficult most times to someone to be that blatant with you. So I would say definitely go in and feel empowered. I mean, you all have a very powerful story to tell. And these members are here to be accountable to their local communities. And I think that's powerful, and you should go in and voice the needs of your communities and the organization you represent.
I am inspired by what you all shared, and I heard you describing a few key takeaways. The first thing is bipartisanship is alive and well. We may even see it well into next year. We've got leadership that have their agendas and are working to address some of the big picture challenges that folks have heard about, and at the same time there's opportunities there to weave in and have achievements, whether it's through the administration or through Congress, that will advance the kind of policies that folks have in their legislative agendas they move forward on Wednesday. And I want to thank you all for being here. Before we end the session, we have a video from a worker who's part of a tech training program that, as we think about a conversation in DC and telling our own stories, I hope folks will listen and reflect on Miguel Hernandez's experience and what it means when we go and lobby on Wednesday to connect to some of people's experiences.
How it was first introduced to Bitwise was a long story. It had really nothing to do with how I was projecting my life for the future in the moment. So when I was younger, I was brought up in a poverty-stricken home with a lot of drug abuse, child abuse, and just everything else in between. And I really didn't know there was another way to live at the time. When it came to being first introduced to Bitwise for the training, it was through a connection through Manchester Mall. And in there, they were helping previously incarcerated people from the ages from 16 to 22. And that's actually when I was introduced to that whole environment of people who weren't even, being involved in helping previously incarcerated people. And I had let them know that I was interested in tech specifically because of my grandparents kind of introducing me young, only using it for games, but still. What inspired me to be involved in the tech, IT, anything involving more or less computers, it was just when I was younger, my grandparents would kind of instill in me the idea of, computers are the future, technology is the future, and it was kind of like whatever to me at the time because I was a kid. Something as simple as computer literacy, I didn't know would take me so far to the point where I would be able to, learn how to do code from this literacy, from just the introduction from that was taught and instilled with my grandparents. Currently, what I'm doing for work is email marketing. And what that pertains is stuff as simple as whenever you receive email in your inbox about a promotion from Macy's and promotion maybe from a Fresno City. I'm kind of that guy where I just create these emails, send them out to a specific recipient list, schedule them from dates and times, depending on analytics from the back. So it's kind of like a mix of analytics, ad buying, and email marketing all put together. I would say one of the biggest successes I had here at Bitwise was going through the actual class itself. Originally, just Salesforce itself as part of the first accomplishment, because that really introduced me to an actual, like, not just culture, but a whole different world of people who are actually willing to, help us. Not only are we working and sitting side by side with the people who are learning as much as we are, but we're actually, being, our hands in the bucket as far as everyone else. So we felt as if we were at the same level as everyone else, even at an apprenticeship position. And when we got that chance, we didn't really know what we were pushing towards besides something that was a paid apprenticeship. And with the confidence of whatever it is, we're gonna be able to learn it regardless. Look how far we came. Skills training is one of the most important, if not the most important thing in the work industry alone. Without the proper education and training for anything, you could be left behind, let alone a work environment where you're being, determined on your value at that company depending on your education and, certificates for that. So I feel like it's something that should be thought of while at school, during school, before, after school. Like, it's really something that people should consider as much as they consider what colleges they need to sign up for while they're going to school. A good job, as far as any term that I grew up on it as, is just a job that makes money and that recognizes your worth. And that's Bitwise. So now that I'm more involved in the tech industry every day, I actually see a lot more open doors and stuff that could be available to us. I think the most important thing to know and take from my story, that I really became somebody who was going to more or less die in the streets, and just through a one classroom, I was able to change my whole family's trajectory. It's because of some of these policies that are already in set for some companies. We can't be hired regardless of our credentials and work experience. But if we're able to have those credentials and work experiences and a lot of stuff that includes tech, which brings it back to being really independently owned and by yourself, we can work by ourselves and work, we don't have to rely on other companies to pass their checks for us to get money, for us to, make an honest living. I would think in the next couple of years from now, where I see myself as still doing the same thing as far as what I'm doing now, like being like a kind of advocate for people who've been previously incarcerated, whether that means speaking for them, as far as just an emotional, standpoint, or an employment standpoint, or just for now, like for policies. I feel like as in the future, I'm gonna just be around the whole circle. I for sure want to be in that kind of ecosystem in the future.
So on that note of inspiration, I want to thank you all for talking about what's happening inside the Beltway, and then ending on something that across the country is being impacted by the work that you all are doing every day and will be doing on Wednesday. So thank you, panelists. Before I let you leave, though, and before I let you clap for them, apparently, a couple housekeeping tips. So tomorrow, breakfast is at 7 o'clock in the Ambassador Room. We'll be back here at 9 o'clock to start the programming. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh. Yeah. Probably don't need my water bottle in the picture. Where do we need to move?
Oh yeah, because I can take it off now, can't I?
Oh.
Yes.
Here you go, my guy.